Hey guys, tonight we're dropping you into the most unforgiving inhabited landscape on planet Earth. Yakutia, in the heart of Siberia, where winter temperatures plunge to minus 71 degrees Celsius and the very air you breathe can crystallize into glittering needles that hang suspended in front of your face. You're standing at the edge of the taiga forest as the sun, a pale, reluctant disk that barely crested the horizon today, begins its rapid descent. In about 90 minutes, full darkness will lock down over you, and you have no fire, no heated shelter, and no rescue team racing to your position. Just you, the clothing on your back, and a landscape so cold that exposed skin freezes solid in under 2 minutes. You probably won't survive this if we're being honest, but let's see how close you can get. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I love seeing how this little community spans the globe, from sunny California mornings to midnight in Mumbai. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've landed here, let's say a helicopter dropped you off for some ill-advised documentary project and the weather turned before they could return. About 40 kilometers outside Oymyakon, the village that holds the record for the coldest permanently inhabited settlement on Earth. The measurement everyone remembers is that minus 71.2 degrees Celsius reading from February 1933, though locals insist it's dropped lower in the decades since. The thermometers just aren't rated to measure beyond a certain point. When mercury freezes at minus 39 degrees Celsius, you need special alcohol-based instruments, and even those become sluggish and unreliable at the extremes. The cold here isn't like a crisp winter morning in Minnesota or a frosty night in the Scottish Highlands. It's a physical presence, an aggressive entity that strips heat from your body through every avenue. Radiation, conduction, convection, evaporation. Faster than your metabolism can generate it. You become, in thermodynamic terms, a losing proposition. Around you, the landscape looks deceptively peaceful. Larch trees, the only conifers hardy enough to survive this far north, stand in sparse formation, their needles long since dropped for winter. These larches are among the few deciduous conifers on the planet, an evolutionary adaptation to cold so severe that keeping needles year-round would mean certain death. The trees would lose too much moisture through transpiration and freeze-dry from the inside out. Their bark is thick and deeply furrowed, providing pockets of insulation. In summer, this area is actually quite beautiful. The permafrost beneath your feet thaws in the top meter or so, creating boggy meadows filled with wildflowers and plagued by mosquitoes so thick they form visible clouds. But now, in January, that permafrost extends down 400 meters or more, an impenetrable foundation of frozen soil and ice that's been locked solid for tens of thousands of years. You take a breath, and the sensation is alarming. The moisture in your nostrils crackles and stiffens instantly. Each inhale burns the delicate membranes of your nasal passages, and if you're foolish enough to breathe through your mouth, the cold sears your throat and lungs. The indigenous Saka people, formerly called Yakuts, though that term is falling out of favor, have lived here for over 1,000 years, and they learned early that rapid breathing in extreme cold can cause the alveoli in your lungs to frost over, leading to a condition that's essentially like breathing through frosted glass. You instinctively slow your breathing, each inhale measured and deliberate, warming the air slightly in your nasal passages before it reaches your lungs. This is your first survival lesson, learned within seconds. Control your breathing or damage your respiratory system before the night even begins. The sun is a hand's width above the horizon now, casting long, pale blue shadows across the snow. At this latitude, about 63 degrees north, winter days are brutally short. In December and January, you get maybe 3 to 4 hours of weak sunlight, more of a twilight really, where the sun schemes along the southern horizon and never quite manages to feel warm. The rest is darkness, and in that darkness, temperatures drop even further. You've heard stories, probably read them before this trip, about what happens here at night. Car engines, even when parked indoors, must be left running continuously or they'll never start again. The oil congeals into something resembling tar, and battery chemistry simply stops functioning. Metal becomes brittle, steel can shatter like glass if struck sharply. Plastic cracks, rubber crumbles, and human tissue, Human tissue freezes hard enough that frostbitten fingers, if you're foolish enough to test this, will produce a woody tapping sound when knocked against a table. You're wearing layers, thank goodness. Whoever dropped you here at least gave you that much. A thick wool base layer, then a down jacket, then an outer shell. Wool pants, heavy boots rated to minus 40 degrees Celsius, though you're already doubting their sufficiency, thick mittens, a fur-lined hat that covers your ears, and a scarf wrapped around your lower face. By the standards of a casual winter hike in Vermont, you're overdressed. By Yakutian standards, you're barely adequate, and the absence of one critical item, a source of heat, tips you from adequately prepared into probably doomed. Hisaka have a saying, roughly translated, cold is not the enemy. Cold is the landscape. Lack of preparation is the enemy. Right now, looking at that sinking sun, you're feeling the weight of that wisdom. Historians still argue whether the Saka migrated north from the steppes near Lake Baikal or originated here in the Arctic, but the archaeological evidence suggests they brought horse-breeding culture with them and adapted it, remarkably, to subarctic conditions. Their traditional winter dwelling, the Urasa, was replaced in coldest months by the Balagan, a partially underground structure with thick log walls, earth insulation, and a small hearth that burned continuously. The key word there, continuously. Fire was never allowed to die in winter because restarting it in extreme cold was difficult and dangerous. Even matches, a relatively modern convenience, stop working reliably below minus 30 degrees Celsius or so. The chemical reaction that produces flame slows and can fail entirely. The Saka kept embers alive in specially designed containers, treated fire as a living thing that required constant care, and built their entire winter survival strategy around maintaining that flame. You have no flame, no embers, no lighter, no matches, no ferrocerium rod to strike sparks. Perhaps they were lost when you fell into a snowdrift an hour back, or perhaps the scenario assumes you're testing the absolute limits of human endurance. Can a person, equipped only with knowledge and the materials immediately available in the environment, survive a single night at minus 71 degrees Celsius without fire? The answer, spoiler alert, is maybe, but you'll earn every minute of that survival and you'll pay a price in tissue damage that might take months to heal, if it heals at all. You start moving because standing still is death. Even with your layers, even with the insulation, standing motionless in this cold means heat loss exceeds heat production within minutes. You begin trudging through the snow, looking for a suitable location. The snow here isn't the wet, heavy stuff you might know from maritime climates. It's dry, crystalline, and squeaky. Each step produces a distinctive chirping sound as the frozen crystals fracture and compact under your boots. This sound is actually a useful indicator. The colder it gets, the higher pitched the squeak, because the ice crystals become harder and more brittle. Right now, your footsteps are singing in a register that tells you it's definitely below minus 50 degrees Celsius, probably closer to minus 60 degrees Celsius or worse. You spot a small clearing with a low ridge on one side, not quite a cliff, but an embankment about 2 meters high where wind or ancient water flow carved the permafrost. This is good. The ridge will serve as a windbreak, and wind, even a light breeze, is catastrophic in extreme cold. Wind chill isn't just a number for weather reports. It's a real, measurable increase in convective heat loss. At minus 60 degrees Celsius with even a 10 kilometers per hour wind, the effective temperature on exposed skin drops to something approaching minus 75 degrees Celsius or minus 80 degrees Celsius. Wind strips away the thin boundary layer of warmer air that your body heat creates around you, replacing it constantly with fresh, frigid air that sucks more heat away. Indigenous peoples across the Arctic share one universal shelter principle. Get out of the wind first, worry about everything else second. The light is fading faster now. That peculiar polar twilight where the world shifts through shades of deep blue and purple before plunging into black. You have maybe 45 minutes of usable light left. Your hands are already aching inside your mittens. Not the sharp pain of acute cold injury yet, but the deep, throbbing ache that tells you your body is prioritizing core temperature over extremities, constricting blood vessels in your fingers and toes to preserve heat for your vital organs. This is vasoconstriction, and it's an automatic response that will save your life in the short term but cost you fingers if it goes on too long. You flex your hands repeatedly, forcing blood back into them, knowing you'll need dexterity for the next hour of work. Here's a fun historical tidbit. Soviet scientists, during their expansive research programs in the mid-20th century, studied cold adaptation extensively in Yakutia, and they discovered something remarkable. Long-term residents, people whose families had lived in extreme cold for generations, showed measurably different circulatory responses than newcomers. Their peripheral blood vessels were more elastic, opening and closing more efficiently, allowing brief surges of warm blood to extremities even in severe cold. A phenomenon called cold-induced vasodilation. It's not enough to prevent frostbite entirely, but it buys precious extra minutes. You, arriving here from wherever you came from, probably lack this adaptation. Your body is working from the standard human playbook, which was written for the African savanna and hasn't been updated for Siberian permafrost. You kneel by the embankment and begin to dig, using your mittened hands to scoop away the top layer of snow. Beneath the fresh powder, the snow is denser, more compacted. This is the good stuff for building. Inuit peoples in North America perfected the igloo, a marvel of engineering where blocks of wind-packed snow are arranged in an ascending spiral to create a dome. The Saka, living in forested regions, typically used wood for shelter, but they understood snow architecture too. Snow, counterintuitively, is an excellent insulator. Those air pockets between ice crystals trap heat the same way down feathers or fiberglass batting does. A properly constructed snow shelter can maintain an interior temperature significantly warmer than the outside air. Maybe not comfortable, maybe only -10 degrees Celsius or -15 degrees Celsius when it's -60 degrees Celsius outside, but that 30 or 40 degree difference is the margin between survival and death. You're not building an igloo, though. You lack the tools, the properly compacted snow, and frankly the expertise. What you're creating is simpler. A snow trench or a Quincy-style hollow. You clear a space against the embankment, digging down and back, creating a small cave that you'll roof over with packed snow. The work is exhausting. Every scoop requires effort, and effort generates heat, which is good, but it also makes you sweat, which is catastrophically bad. Sweat is moisture, and moisture in your clothing layers destroys their insulating ability. Wet insulation conducts heat away from your body up to 25 times faster than dry insulation. The Saka have another saying, this one learned by every child: sweat is death. You force yourself to work steadily but not frantically, trying to generate just enough heat to stay functional without soaking your base layers. 20 minutes later, you've carved out a hollow roughly 1 meter deep, 1.5 meters wide, and long enough for you to lie down in a fetal position. It's not spacious, it's not comfortable, but it's progress. You take a moment to rest, breathing carefully, and you notice something strange. You can see your breath, of course, but the cloud of moisture you exhale doesn't dissipate normally. Instead, it forms tiny ice crystals that fall to the ground around you like microscopic diamonds. This is ice fog, a phenomenon that occurs when the air is so cold that exhaled moisture flash freezes into visible particles. In town, when many people and heated buildings contribute moisture to the air, ice fog can become thick enough to reduce visibility to a few meters. Out here, it's just you and your breath, creating small, glittering proof of how alien this environment is. The temperature is still dropping. You can feel it in the increasing stiffness of your clothing, the way your mittens are becoming less flexible, the deeper ache in your cheekbones where the cold is penetrating through skin and muscle to the bone beneath. You need to finish this shelter before full darkness, and you need to insulate yourself better than your current clothing allows. This is where indigenous knowledge becomes your lifeline, because while you don't have reindeer hides or traditional Saka winter gear, you have access to the materials they would have used in an emergency. Organic matter from the forest itself. You stomp over to the nearest larch tree, moving stiffly now, and begin examining the forest floor around its base. Even in deep winter, even under snow, there are resources here. You brush away snow and find what you're looking for. Larch bark strips, shed from the tree during past summers and preserved in the dry cold. You gather handfuls of these, along with dry twigs, dead moss that clings to the tree's lower trunk, and anything else that might serve as additional insulation. The bark is particularly valuable. It's fibrous, relatively flexible even when frozen, and full of air pockets. Indigenous peoples across boreal forests used birch and larch bark for everything from roofing material to emergency footwear insulation. You return to your hollow with arms full of forest debris and begin layering it on the floor of your shelter. The ground, remember, is permafrost, frozen soil that will suck heat from your body through conduction faster than almost any other surface. Lying directly on it, even with your clothing, would be fatal. You create a mat of bark and twigs, 6 or 7 centimeters thick, then pack snow around and over your hollow, except for a small entrance at one end. You're creating a cave now, a dim space that's protected from wind and somewhat insulated from the horrific air temperature outside. The sun is gone. Twilight is deepening into true darkness, and the temperature, if you had a thermometer, would show another 5-degree drop in the last 30 minutes. Night in Yakutia during deep winter is when the cold truly reveals itself, when the earth radiates its stored heat into a clear, star-filled sky and receives nothing in return. You crawl into your shelter, pulling more loose snow in behind you to block the entrance, leaving just a small gap for ventilation. Because yes, even at minus 71 degrees Celsius, you need fresh air flow. Carbon dioxide buildup in a sealed shelter will put you to sleep permanently, and while that might seem like an easier death than freezing, it's still death, and we're trying to avoid that tonight. Inside your snow cave, it's dark and quiet. The silence so profound that you can hear the faint ticking of ice crystals settling in the snow around you. You're lying on your side in a fetal position, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around your torso. This position minimizes surface area, reduces heat loss, and also happens to be the natural position the body assumes in extreme cold, because your physiology is trying to protect your core, where your heart, lungs, and other vital organs are fighting to maintain the 37 degrees Celsius necessary for human life. Outside, the cold is approaching 3 times colder than your body temperature, an energy gradient so steep that physics itself seems hostile to your existence. Your first hour without fire in minus 71 degrees Celsius Yakutia has begun, and already you're learning that survival here isn't about conquering the cold. It's about negotiating with it, buying time in minutes and hours, and hoping that dawn comes before your body runs out of currency to spend. You lie in your snow hollow, catching your breath and taking stock, and the first thing you notice is that it's marginally less brutally cold in here. Not warm, not even comfortable, but the edge has been taken off. Without a thermometer, you're guessing, but the shelter is probably sitting somewhere around minus 40 degrees Celsius or minus 45 degrees Celsius, which sounds absurd until you remember that outside it's approaching minus 70 degrees Celsius. That 25 or 30 degree difference is enormous in survival terms. It's the difference between tissue freezing in 90 seconds versus 5 or 6 minutes. It's the difference between your body burning through its energy reserves in 2 hours versus maybe making it to dawn. The Inuit understood this principle intimately. Their word for the interior of a properly built snow house, ikluk, referred not just to the structure but to the life-sustaining microclimate it created. You've built something crude by comparison, more of a snow grave than a proper shelter, but it's enough to shift the odds slightly in your favor. But now you face the second challenge. Your current insulation is inadequate, and the night has barely begun. You're lying on your mat of bark and twigs, and already you can feel cold seeping up through it from the permafrost below. Your clothing, the wool, the down, the synthetic shell is good gear, probably cost someone a few $100s at an outdoor retailer, but it was designed for winter camping in the Rockies, not for sleeping without heat in the coldest inhabited place on Earth. Modern outdoor gear operates on a principle of layering and air trapping, using synthetic fibers and down feathers to create dead airspace. The problem is that all insulation has limits, and you're well beyond those limits. You need more. You need what the Saka would have used, organic insulation harvested from the subarctic ecosystem itself. Let's talk about reindeer for a moment, because if you were a traditional Saka person in this situation, reindeer would be your salvation. Reindeer hide is arguably the finest natural cold weather material on the planet. Each hair is hollow, creating thousands of tiny air-filled tubes that trap warmth while remaining lightweight. A winter reindeer hide has 2 layers, dense underfur close to the skin and longer guard hairs on top. Together, they create an insulation system so effective that reindeer can sleep comfortably on snow at minus 50 degrees Celsius, their body heat barely escaping through their coat. Saka winter clothing traditionally consisted of a doha, a long coat made from reindeer hide, worn hairside in with a second layer on top, hairside out. Between these layers, air trapped in the hollow hairs created an insulation barrier that could keep a person warm even during days-long winter journeys across the taiga. Some historians estimate that a properly made reindeer hide outfit could keep a person alive in stationary conditions down to perhaps minus 60 degrees Celsius or minus 65 degrees Celsius without external heat, assuming they had enough food to fuel their metabolism. You don't have reindeer hide. You don't have any animal hide. What you have is your modern clothing and whatever you can harvest from the winter forest in the dark. So you're going to have to improvise, drawing on techniques that predate even the Saka, going back to basic principles that kept humans alive during the Pleistocene ice ages. Before synthetic fabrics, before woven textiles, there was stuffing bulk organic matter crammed into clothing and shelters to add insulation. It's crude, it's itchy, and it works. You carefully unzip your outer jacket, moving slowly because the zipper is stiff with cold and forcing it might break the mechanism, leaving you unable to seal the jacket again. The cold hits your torso immediately even through your inner layers, a sharp reminder that you're operating on razor-thin margins. You reach outside through the entrance gap and grab handfuls of the dry moss and fine bark strips you gathered earlier. This material is remarkably preserved. In the dry, cold climate of Yakutia, organic matter can remain intact for decades or even centuries. There are mammoth carcasses here, after all, pulled from the permafrost with flesh and hair still attached after 40,000 years. Your moss and bark are merely a few years old, desiccated and frozen but still structurally sound. You begin stuffing this material between your base layer and your down jacket, focusing first on your torso, the core that must be protected above all else. You pack moss around your sides, your lower back, across your chest. It's lumpy and uncomfortable, making you look like some kind of scarecrow, but you're adding inches of insulation, creating more dead air space, more barriers between your body heat and the murderous cold outside. The Saka actually did this with their traditional clothing during extreme cold snaps. They'd stuff dried grass, or something called moss wool, actually a lichen, into the space between their inner and outer garments. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or reserved for emergencies, but survival manuals from Soviet-era northern explorers document it as a field expedient technique. Next, your legs. Your wool pants are good but not sufficient. You need more around your thighs and calves, where major blood vessels run close to the surface and lose heat readily. You pull your pants away from your long underwear and begin stuffing bark strips and moss down each leg, working them down toward your boots. It's awkward work in the confined space, and you have to be careful not to compress the material too much. Remember, insulation works by trapping air, and overcompressed organic matter loses its effectiveness. You want that springy resilience that indicates air pockets are intact. Your hands are becoming clumsy now, the deep ache intensifying into something sharper, more urgent. You stop the stuffing process and force yourself to do what seems counterintuitive. You remove your mittens and tuck your bare hands into your armpits, underneath your jacket and all the newly added moss, pressing them against the warmth of your core. The pain that follows is excruciating. A burning, stabbing sensation as blood flow returns to your fingers. This is actually a good sign. It means the tissue is still viable, still responsive. Frostbite in its early stages, called frost nip, is reversible if you catch it quickly. The danger is when you lose sensation entirely and the tissue turns white or grayish yellow. That's deep frostbite, where ice crystals have formed inside your cells and ruptured the cell walls. That's tissue death, irreversible, and the reason why Yakutian hospitals in winter have entire wards dedicated to amputation and reconstruction. 3 minutes with your hands in your armpits, flexing your fingers against your ribs, and sensation returns enough for you to work again. You pull your mittens back on. They're cold now from sitting in the minus 40 degrees Celsius interior air, but they warm quickly from your body heat. You've learned something crucial. You'll need to do this warm-up cycle regularly throughout the night, probably every 30 to 40 minutes, to prevent permanent damage to your extremities. It's exhausting just thinking about it, this constant vigilance, but the alternative is waking up at dawn with blackened fingers that will eventually mummify and fall off. Now for your feet, which are arguably your most vulnerable points. Your boots are good, rated to minus 40 degrees Celsius with thick insulation and vapor barriers, but your toes are already going numb, that telltale tingling that precedes frostbite. The problem with feet is that they're at the extreme end of your circulatory system, farthest from your heart, and they're pressed against the cold ground despite your bark mat. Indigenous peoples across the Arctic developed sophisticated footwear to address this. The Saka winter boot, called an etterbjøs, was made from reindeer leg hide. The lower leg hide is the warmest part because it protects the animal's extremities in snow. Inside the boot went layers of dried grass, which served as both insulation and moisture management. The grass would be changed daily because even in extreme cold, feet sweat slightly, and that moisture had to be removed before it froze. Frozen moisture in footwear is a death sentence. Ice conducts heat away much faster than air. You can't change your socks or add grass to your boots. Well, you could, but removing your boots in this cold is extremely risky. If you drop a boot, if the sweat on your socks flash freezes before you can get the boot back on, you're looking at almost certain severe frostbite. Instead, you do the next best thing. You remove the scarf from around your face and wrap it around your boots, over the outside, adding an extra layer of insulation between your feet and the cold air. Your face is now more exposed, which is a trade-off, but you can bury your face against your knees in your fetal position, using your own legs as a windbreak for your nose and cheeks. You're starting to understand why the Saka built their entire winter lifestyle around immobility. Traditionally, during the worst cold snaps, when temperatures dropped below -60 degrees Celsius, people simply didn't go outside except for absolute necessities. They stayed in their balagans, near the fire, minimizing movement to conserve energy and reduce the risk of sweating. Travel was planned around warmer days, relatively speaking, and longer journeys were undertaken only when the forecast promised a high of, say, -40 degrees Celsius instead of -60 degrees Celsius. The idea of sleeping outside, without fire, in deep winter was so foreign to their survival strategy that it probably didn't even have a name. It was simply unthinkable. Yet here you are, attempting the unthinkable, and you're doing it because you're testing the absolute limits of human endurance against a landscape that has killed countless people throughout history. There are stories, preserved in Soviet archives and in Saka oral tradition, of entire hunting parties lost to sudden cold snaps, of travelers found frozen solid just kilometers from safety, of children who stepped outside for a moment and never made it back. The cold here is patient and absolute. It doesn't hate you. It doesn't even notice you. It simply is an ambient condition of the universe in this place, and your survival is utterly irrelevant to it. Outside your shelter, you hear a sound, sharp cracks, like distant gunfire, echoing across the taiga. These are trees exploding. When the temperature drops below -55 degrees Celsius or so, the moisture deep inside tree trunks can freeze and expand, creating enough pressure to split the wood with explosive force. It's called frostquake, cracking, and in a quiet winter night, the sound can carry for kilometers. The indigenous peoples heard these sounds for centuries and incorporated them into their cosmology. Some Saka legends speak of the spirits of cold announcing their presence through the breaking trees. The scientific explanation is less poetic but more terrifying. The cold is so intense that it's literally tearing the forest apart. You conduct a mental inventory of your situation. It's been perhaps 90 minutes since sunset. The darkest, coldest part of the night is still hours away. Typically, the minimum temperature occurs just before dawn, when the Earth has radiated away its heat for the entire night and the sun hasn't yet begun to add any new energy to the system. You're lying in a snow shelter that's maybe -40 degrees Celsius inside, wearing clothing stuffed with forest debris, and you're already struggling to keep your extremities viable. Your core feels okay for now, you're not shivering violently yet, which is good, but you're deeply uncomfortable, and discomfort has a way of eroding decision-making ability. Hypothermia doesn't just freeze your body. It freezes your mind, making you lethargic, confused, and eventually apathetic about your own survival. Here's a quirky historical tidbit that might distract you from your discomfort. In the 1920s, a Soviet researcher named Vladimir Yakobson spent 3 winters in Yakutia studying cold adaptation, and he documented something bizarre. He noticed that long-term residents had a different emotional relationship with cold than visitors did. Where newcomers reported feelings of dread, anxiety, and claustrophobia during extreme cold snaps, locals reported something closer to respect, acceptance. Jakobson theorized that cultural framing changed the psychological experience of cold. If you grow up with stories and traditions that teach you cold is a natural part of your world rather than an enemy, you experience less stress and thus conserve more energy. It's a controversial idea, and modern researchers still debate whether psychological attitude can measurably affect cold survival, but there's something to it. Your own anxiety right now, the racing thoughts, the constant checking and rechecking of your body for warning signs, is burning calories and releasing stress hormones that, in excess, can impair your circulation. You try to settle your mind, to breathe slowly and deliberately. This is harder than it sounds because the cold air, even warmed slightly by your shelter, still burns your lungs. You adopt a technique you've read about, something practiced by Arctic indigenous peoples and Tibetan monks in unheated monasteries. You breathe in through your nose very slowly, letting the air warm in your nasal passages and sinuses before it reaches your lungs, and then you exhale through slightly pursed lips, even more slowly, retaining as much body heat as possible. Some researchers call this polar breathing, and there's evidence it can reduce respiratory heat loss by 15 or 20%. Every percentage point matters when you're already in energy deficit. The moss stuffed in your clothing is starting to feel less strange. It's conforming to your body shape, filling gaps, and you hope that it's actually working, that you've added enough insulation to change the equation. A human at rest produces something like 100 watts of heat, about the same as a bright incandescent light bulb. In normal conditions, that's more than enough to maintain body temperature. But in minus 71 degrees Celsius, you're fighting an enormous thermal gradient, and your body is radiating heat into the environment much faster than it can produce it. Your stuffed clothing and snow shelter are trying to trap that heat, to keep it close to your body long enough to maintain core temperature. It's a race between heat production and heat loss, and it will run for the next 8 or 9 hours until dawn. You shift position slightly, trying to get more comfortable, and you realize that comfort is a relative term now. You're not looking for cozy, you're looking for survivable. Your back aches from lying on the uneven mat of bark. Your hip is pressed against frozen organic matter. Your neck is cramped from staying in a curved position. But you're alive, you're conscious, and you're maintaining core temperature for now. That's as close to success as you're going to get tonight. Time to address one more critical area: your head. Your fur hat is good, covering your ears, but your scalp is a major source of heat loss. The old saying that you lose most of your body heat through your head is actually a myth. You lose heat proportionally to surface area, and your head is only about 10% of your body's surface. But that 10% matters enormously, especially because your brain is extremely sensitive to temperature changes. A drop of just a couple of degrees in brain temperature causes confusion and impaired judgment. A drop of a few more degrees and you lose consciousness. You take your scarf. Wait, no, you used that on your boots. Okay, improvisation time. You pull your jacket hood up over your hat, cinching it tight, and then you pack some of your remaining moss around your head and neck inside the hood. Now you look absolutely ridiculous. A lumpy, moss-filled humanoid lying in a snow hole. But vanity is not a survival trait. Ridiculousness, on the other hand, apparently is. Lying here in the dark, packed with moss like some kind of organic mummy, you realize that you've done everything you can do for passive insulation. Your shelter is built, your clothing is augmented, your extremities are as protected as you can make them without better materials. Now comes the hard part. The waiting, the long night of vigilance, the mental battle to stay alert and keep assessing your body for warning signs of cold injury. Sleep would be dangerous, not immediately fatal maybe, but you could easily sleep through the warning signs that you need to warm your hands or adjust position. And yet, you're exhausted. The work of building the shelter, the stress, the cold itself, all of it is draining your energy reserves. This is the paradox of extreme cold survival. You need to rest to conserve energy, but you need to stay alert to manage your survival. The Saka had an advantage here. They survived in groups, taking shifts to tend the fire and watch for problems. Alone, you have no backup, no one to shake you awake if you start slipping into hypothermic stupor. You'll have to rely on your body's own alarm systems, the pain of cold injury, the violent shivering that will come if your core temperature starts dropping, to keep you conscious and responsive. You check your hands again, pulling them into your armpits. They're cold but not frozen. Good. You flex your toes inside your boots, feeling the painful tingling that means circulation is still reaching them. Also good. Your face, buried against your knees, Feels numb but not frozen solid numb. Acceptable. You're holding the line, and the night is still young. The darkness inside your snow shelter is absolute. The kind of blackness that makes you question whether your eyes are even open. You blink a few times, testing, and yes, your eyelids are moving, but it makes no difference. There's simply no light to see by. Outside, the stars are probably blazing in that crystalline Arctic clarity, undimmed by humidity or light pollution, but in here you might as well be sealed in a tomb. The comparison is uncomfortable, and you push it away, focusing instead on what you can sense. The texture of the bark beneath you, the pressure of moss against your ribs, the ache in your hip, the slow rhythm of your controlled breathing. Touch, pressure, temperature, pain. These are your senses now, and they're screaming that you're in a profoundly unnatural situation. You've been in the shelter for perhaps 2 hours, maybe 3. It's genuinely hard to tell without being able to check a watch, and even if you could, pulling your arm out of your jacket to look at a watch face would cost you precious heat and risk frostbite on your wrist. Time has become elastic, measured not in minutes but in cycles of discomfort. There's the cycle of checking your extremities. Hands into armpits, count to 200, flex fingers, return hands to mittens, wait until the ache becomes sharp pain. Repeat. There's the cycle of toe flexing. Squeeze all 10 toes, release, rotate ankles, point and flex. Wait until the numbness becomes alarming. Repeat. And there's the cycle of position adjustment. Shift weight from right hip to left hip, arch back slightly to relieve pressure, curl tighter into fetal position, endure until muscles cramp. Repeat. Between these cycles, you're trying something that feels both desperate and necessary. You're attempting to generate more body heat through isometric exercises. The principle is simple. Muscle contraction requires energy and produces heat as a byproduct. Every shiver you've ever experienced is exactly this. Your muscles contracting rapidly to generate warmth. But shivering is involuntary and relatively inefficient. Voluntary muscle tension can be more controlled and sustained. So you're lying here in your moss-stuffed clothing, systematically tensing and releasing muscle groups. Clench your thighs, hold for 10 seconds, release. Tighten your core muscles, hold, release. Squeeze your buttocks, which sounds absurd but involves some of the largest muscles in your body, hold, release. Press your arms against your sides, hold, release. This technique has roots in both modern survival training and ancient practice. Tibetan Buddhist monks, practicing a meditation technique called tummo, claim to be able to raise their body temperature through controlled breathing and visualization. Western researchers have studied this and found that, yes, experienced practitioners can measurably increase their core and peripheral temperature, though probably not enough to survive minus 71 degrees Celsius without shelter. The mechanism isn't mystical. It's thermogenics combined with improved circulation control. You're attempting a crude version of this, minus the years of training and spiritual framework. Every bit of extra heat you can generate is heat that doesn't have to come from your dwindling calorie reserves. Speaking of calories, you're starting to understand viscerally why extreme cold is so metabolically expensive. Your body is burning fuel at an accelerated rate just to maintain 37 degrees Celsius against the gradient. Normally, at rest, an adult human burns roughly 1,500 to 2,000 calories per day. In extreme cold, that number can double or even triple. Polar explorers have documented daily calorie needs exceeding 5,000 or 6,000 calories when traveling in severe cold. And even when stationary in unheated shelters, their calorie consumption remained above 3,000. Your body is essentially a furnace right now, and that furnace requires fuel. The problem is that you haven't eaten in hours. Let's say you had a decent meal before the helicopter dropped you off, but that was 6 or 7 hours ago, and your stomach is empty. Your glycogen stores, the easily accessible sugar reserves in your liver and muscles, are depleting. Soon your body will have to switch to burning fat, which is less efficient and produces less heat per unit of time. If you were a traditional Saka person preparing for winter travel, you'd have eaten a massive meal before leaving, not just for calories but specifically for fat. The diet here traditionally was incredibly high fat by modern standards. Reindeer meat, horse meat, fatty fish, fermented mare's milk, and butter. A winter traveler might consume 50% or more of their calories from fat, which provides more than double the calories per gram compared to carbohydrates or protein. They understood, through centuries of trial and error, that fat was winter fuel. Modern nutritionists sometimes struggle with this reality because it contradicts the low-fat dietary advice that dominated the late 20th century. But in extreme cold, fat isn't just food, it's survival equipment. You have no food. This is bad, but it's not immediately catastrophic. A healthy adult can survive weeks without food, though not comfortably. The more pressing issue is that without food, your heat production will decline over the course of the night, and as dawn approaches, when the cold is typically most intense, you'll be at your weakest, metabolically speaking. It's another cruel equation. The coldest hour requires the most heat production just when your body has the least fuel available. You make a mental note that if you survive this night, the first thing you do is eat everything you can find. But that's a problem for Dawn You. Right now, you at hour 3 has other concerns. Your face is starting to feel strange. You've kept it buried against your knees, breathing into the small pocket of air trapped there. But even so, your cheeks and nose are going numb in a way that feels different from your fingers or toes. Facial frostbite is particularly insidious because the face has less subcutaneous fat than other body parts, and because social conditioning makes us less likely to cover our faces completely. We want to see, to breathe freely, to speak. But in minus 71 degrees Celsius, exposed facial skin freezes in under 90 seconds. You've been careful, keeping your face protected, but careful might not be careful enough. You risk a quick check, moving one hand up from your core to touch your nose. Even through your mitten, you can tell something's wrong. Your nose feels hard, unyielding, like cold wax. This is frostnip progressing toward frostbite. You need to warm it now, and the only heat source you have is your own body. You pull your hand out of its mitten. The pain is immediate and shocking, and press your bare palm against your nose, feeling the cold of your facial skin leach warmth from your hand. You count to 30, fighting the urge to pull your hand away, then switch hands, giving your first hand a chance to recover against your core while the second hand warms your nose. Back and forth, a desperate shuffling of limited heat resources, borrowing from Peter to pay Paul while hoping the whole system doesn't collapse. Historians still argue whether pre-contact Arctic peoples experienced less facial frostbite than modern people, or whether they just accepted it as inevitable. There are accounts from early European explorers of meeting indigenous people with scarred, damaged facial tissue, evidence of repeated cold injury. But there are also accounts of indigenous cold weather gear that covered the face almost entirely, masks made from fur, with tiny eye slits and breathing holes, designed to trap expelled air and pre-warm inhaled air. The Saka developed a face covering called a bashilk, essentially a long hood that could be wrapped around the face multiple times, leaving only the eyes exposed. You don't have a bashilk. You have your moss-stuffed jacket hood and your determination not to lose your nose to frostbite, which will have to suffice. After 5 minutes of this warming routine, your nose feels less wooden, more like actual flesh. You tuck both hands back into your armpits and return your face to the shelter of your knees. Crisis managed, for now. But you're learning that, for now, is the operative phrase tonight. Nothing is permanently fixed. Everything requires constant attention, and the cold is relentless in finding new vulnerabilities. Let's talk about what's happening to your body on a cellular level, because understanding the mechanism might help you appreciate the stakes. When tissue is exposed to extreme cold, the water inside and between your cells begins to freeze. This sounds straightforward, but it's actually a complex, destructive process. As ice crystals form, they expand. Water is one of the few substances that takes up more volume when frozen than when liquid. These expanding crystals are sharp, jagged at the molecular level, and they puncture cell membranes like tiny knives. Meanwhile, the act of water freezing concentrates the salts and other dissolved substances in the remaining liquid, creating a hypertonic environment that pulls more water out of cells through osmosis, dehydrating them even as they're freezing. The cells crumple, burst, die. Later, if the tissue is rewarmed, the damage becomes apparent. The tissue turns black as dead cells necrotize, and the body eventually sheds the dead tissue like a tree shedding a damaged branch. This is why severe frostbite results in amputation. There's simply no living tissue left to save. The good news, such as it is that frostbite has stages. Frostnip, the earliest stage, involves surface cooling and ice crystal formation but limited cellular damage. If caught early and warmed, frostnip resolves with no permanent injury. This is what you're fighting on your nose and fingers, early-stage injury that's still reversible. The key is never letting it progress to deeper stages, which means endless vigilance, constant warming cycles, and accepting that pain is information, not something to be ignored. You're thirsty now, which is another paradox of cold survival. People think of thirst as a hot weather problem, but in extreme cold, your body loses moisture through several routes. First, there's respiratory water loss. Every breath you exhale carries moisture that your lungs have added to the air, and in dry, cold environments, you can lose a surprising amount of water this way. Second, the cold itself induces something called cold diuresis, where your body constricts peripheral blood vessels and the kidneys interpret the increased central blood volume as a signal to eliminate fluid. It's a hormonal response that dates back to our evolutionary history, and it's completely inappropriate for survival in extreme cold but happens anyway. The result is that you're becoming dehydrated even though you're surrounded by frozen water. The obvious solution is to eat snow, but this is actually dangerous if done incorrectly. Snow is frozen, obviously, and bringing it up to body temperature requires heat, which means calories. If you eat large amounts of snow, you're essentially refrigerating yourself from the inside, forcing your core to expend precious energy warming the ice. The traditional method is to melt snow in your mouth, slowly, letting small amounts of ice turn to water before swallowing. Or better yet, tuck a small amount of snow between your inner clothing layers and let your body heat melt it over time. Then drink the resulting water. You decide to try this. You reach outside your shelter, the temperature difference is shocking, even though it's only moving from -40 degrees Celsius to -70 degrees Celsius, and grab a handful of clean snow. You tuck it into a small depression you create in the moss stuffing near your stomach. Over the next 30 minutes, your body heat will gradually melt it, and you'll have a few ounces of water without the shock of eating ice directly. Time is doing that elastic thing again, stretching and compressing in ways that feel hallucinatory even though you're still fully conscious. You might have been in this shelter for 4 hours or maybe 3 or possibly 5. Your watch, that reliable arbiter of objective time, is inaccessible under layers of clothing, and even if you could see it, what difference would it make? Dawn comes when it comes, dependent on Earth's rotation and your latitude, utterly indifferent to your desire for it to hurry up. To keep your mind sharp, because a foggy, hypothermic brain is a dying brain, you start running through mental exercises. You recite poetry you memorized in school, stumbling over forgotten lines. You calculate mathematics. If the shelter is -40 degrees Celsius and outside is -71 degrees Celsius, that's a 31-degree difference, and your clothing and shelter are providing that insulation, but how many watts of heat are you losing, and how long until your caloric reserves are exhausted? The math gets fuzzy because you don't actually know the thermal properties of moss and bark, and you're making guesses about your body's heat production, but the exercise itself is valuable. It keeps your prefrontal cortex engaged, fighting against the mental dullness that hypothermia brings. You think about the people who have survived similar ordeals because surely someone has, right? History is full of improbable survival stories. There's that famous case of Anna Begenholm, the Swedish radiologist who fell through ice in 1999 and was submerged in freezing water for 80 minutes before being rescued. Her core temperature dropped to 13.7 degrees Celsius, the lowest recorded body temperature in an accidentally hypothermic patient who survived. And she was clinically dead, no heartbeat, for hours before doctors managed to revive her. But she was rescued, warmed in a hospital with advanced rewarming equipment, and she was in cold water, which is different from cold air. Water conducts heat away roughly 25 times faster than air, so in some ways her situation was more immediately dire but also more amenable to suspended animation. The cold water rapidly cooled her brain, protecting it from hypoxic damage. Your situation is different. You're in air, losing heat more slowly, which is good, but you're also without any rescue possibility, which is very bad. You're trying to maintain normothermia, normal body temperature, through the entire night, not slip into hypothermia and hope for revival. This requires staying conscious, staying alert, and maintaining metabolic heat production. It's exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with mental vigilance. You're tired, so deeply tired, and the temptation to just close your eyes and rest is powerful. But rest, right now, could mean never waking up. So you keep doing your exercises. Tense and release. Check extremities. Adjust position. Breathe carefully. Monitor your nose. Flex toes. And occasionally, just to hear something other than your own breathing and the settling snow, you hum. It's tuneless, quiet, just a vibration in your chest. But it's life. It's proof that you're still here, still functioning. The Saka have throat singing traditions, not as elaborate as Tuvan throat singing, but still present. And there are stories of winter travelers singing to themselves through long, dark nights, the sound serving as both comfort and mental anchor. You're not going to attempt throat singing, you barely know how, but your quiet humming serves a similar purpose. It's your voice, pushing back against the void. Outside, you hear those tree-cracking sounds again, the frost quakes that signal temperatures in the lethal range. Each crack is a reminder of where you are, what you're attempting. This is Yakutia in deep winter, a landscape that has killed people far better prepared than you, and you're lying in a snow hole stuffed with moss, trying to last until dawn through sheer stubborn refusal to die. It's absurd. It's desperate. And for now, somehow, it's working. Your body is beginning to betray you in subtle ways that accumulate into something approaching alarm. The shivering has started. Not the violent, teeth-chattering convulsions that signal acute hypothermia, but a deeper, rhythmic trembling that emanates from your core and radiates outward. This is thermogenesis, your body's automatic response to cold stress, and it's both encouraging and deeply concerning. Encouraging because it means your hypothalamus is still functioning, still detecting the temperature drop and triggering countermeasures. Concerning because shivering is metabolically expensive. Burning through your calorie reserves 3 to 5 times faster than resting metabolism. You're already running on empty stomach-wise, and now your body has kicked into high gear, desperately trying to generate heat through involuntary muscle contractions. The shivering comes in waves, each one lasting perhaps 30 or 40 seconds before subsiding into tremors, then building again. During the peaks, you lose fine motor control, your fingers, already clumsy from cold, become essentially useless, unable to perform any task more complex than making a fist. This is why hypothermia is so dangerous in survival situations. As your core temperature drops, you progressively lose the ability to help yourself. First, you can't work a zipper or tie a knot, then you can't light a match or use a knife, then you can't even coordinate your movements well enough to walk in a straight line. It's a descending spiral where each increment of cooling makes you less capable of reversing the cooling. Right now, you're in the early stages, uncomfortable, shivering, but still cognitively intact. The question is whether you can hold this position until dawn or whether you'll slide further down that spiral. Let's talk about what's happening inside your body right now, because the physiology of cold stress is both fascinating and terrifying. Your hypothalamus, that almond-sized region at the base of your brain, contains your body's thermostat. It receives input from temperature sensors in your skin, your core, and your spinal cord, integrating all this information to determine whether you're too hot, too cold, or just right. Right now, those sensors are screaming that you're in severe cold stress, and your hypothalamus is pulling every lever it has available. First lever, vasoconstriction. Blood vessels in your skin, hands, feet, and other peripheral areas clamp down, shunting blood away from the shell and toward the core. This is why your fingers and toes have been aching. They're receiving minimal blood flow, just barely enough to keep tissue alive. Second lever, shivering thermogenesis. Your muscles receive signals to contract rapidly, generating heat through friction and metabolic activity. Third lever, non-shivering thermogenesis, where brown adipose tissue, a special kind of fat that babies have in abundance and adults retain in small amounts, burns fuel to produce heat without muscle contraction. This is less effective in adults, but every bit helps. But here's the problem. All of these responses require fuel, and you're running low. Your glycogen stores are nearly exhausted. Your body is beginning to break down fat for energy, but fat metabolism is slower and less efficient than sugar metabolism. And if you continue in severe cold stress for many more hours, your body will eventually begin catabolizing muscle tissue, breaking down your own protein for fuel in a desperate last-ditch effort to keep the furnace burning. This is why explorers lost in cold environments often emerge looking skeletal. They've literally consumed themselves to stay warm. You're not there yet, not even close, but the trajectory is clear if dawn doesn't come soon. Your hands need attention again. You pull them into your armpits, going through the now familiar routine, but this time the pain is worse, sharper, like needles being driven under your fingernails. This is actually a positive sign. Pain means nerve function is intact, means the tissue is responsive, but positive doesn't mean pleasant. You count to 300 this time, really trying to drive warmth back into your fingers, and when you flex them, the joints crack audibly in the darkness. The synovial fluid in your joints is thickening in the cold, becoming sluggish, and the sound is your body struggling against physics. There's a phenomenon that Soviet researchers documented in Yakutia in the 1950s and 60s during their extensive studies of human cold adaptation. They found that certain long-term residents showed enhanced cold tolerance through a mechanism they called habituation with metabolic compensation. Essentially, these individuals had trained their bodies, over years or decades, to maintain peripheral circulation longer before triggering vasoconstriction, and their baseline metabolic rate ran slightly higher, providing more heat production. But, and this is the crucial part, this adaptation took years to develop and required continuous exposure. You can't develop cold adaptation in a single night any more than you can develop a marathon runner's endurance in a single run. Your body is working from the standard template, the default human response to cold, which evolved in Africa and is frankly inadequate for Yakutia in January. You shift position again, rolling slightly to take pressure off your left hip, which has gone beyond aching into a specific, localized pain that suggests tissue damage from prolonged compression against the frozen bark mat. Pressure sores, bed sores, can develop in surprisingly short periods when you're immobile on hard surfaces. And while this is normally a concern for hospital patients and people with mobility issues, it's relevant now because your body's ability to heal damage is compromised by the cold and your depleted energy state. Every minor injury, every small mistake, carries amplified consequences. A blister becomes an infection risk. A pressure sore becomes a site of tissue necrosis. A slightly twisted ankle becomes a mobility-ending disaster. The darkness is playing tricks now, not visual hallucinations exactly. You can't hallucinate sight when there's no light but phantom sensations. You feel like the walls of your shelter are pressing in, even though you know the snow structure is stable. You feel like you're tilting, sliding downhill, even though you're stationary on level ground. These are products of sensory deprivation combined with stress, your brain trying to make sense of minimal input and filling in blanks with false signals. It's disorienting but not yet alarming. True hypothermic hallucinations come later, when core temperature drops below 32 degrees Celsius or so, and people start seeing things that aren't there, hearing voices, experiencing elaborate delusions. You're nowhere near that threshold, you hope. Your toes are the weak point now. Your fingers you can warm against your core relatively easily, and your face is manageable by pressing your hands against it periodically. But your toes are trapped in boots, at the far end of your legs, pressed against the ground despite your insulation efforts. They've gone from painful to numb, and numb is dangerous because it means you've lost your warning system. You try wiggling them, flexing and pointing your feet, and you think you feel movement but you're not entirely sure. The lack of sensation creates a spiral of anxiety. Are your toes still okay? Or are they freezing right now while you lie here helpless to intervene? There's a technique you remember reading about, something from mountaineering literature, the hot aches. When climbers rewarm frozen fingers or toes, they experience excruciating pain as blood flow returns and nerves wake back up. The pain can be so intense that grown men cry, and it can last 20 or 30 minutes. But the pain is good, it's the price of tissue survival, proof that the extremity is viable and recovering. What you want desperately is hot aches. What you fear is continued numbness, because continued numbness means the tissue is dying quietly, beyond your ability to save it. You make a decision, you're going to create heat specifically for your feet, even though it's risky and awkward. You contort in your confined space, drawing your knees up even tighter, and you pull your feet as close to your torso as possible. Then you reach down, your back screams in protest at the position, and you tuck your mittened hands around your boots, trying to transfer body heat from your hands through the boot material to your feet. It's inefficient, but it's something. You hold this position, ignoring the muscle strain, for what feels like 5 minutes, then carefully extend back to your fetal position. Did it help? Maybe. Hard to say. But action, even uncertain action, feels better than passive waiting. Historians still argue whether the Saka concept of oloro, roughly translated as the cold that brings death, referred to a specific temperature threshold or was more of a spiritual concept, a recognition of cold as an active force rather than merely the absence of heat. The question is more than academic because it speaks to how different cultures conceptualize environmental hazards. Western science views cold as physics, a problem to be solved with insulation and energy. Traditional Saka culture viewed cold as something to be respected, negotiated with, perhaps even appeased through ritual and proper behavior. Both frameworks lead to survival strategies, but they're psychologically different. You, lying here in your moss-stuffed clothing, are experiencing cold as physics, heat transfer, thermodynamics, metabolic rates. But you're also starting to understand it as presence, as entity, as something that feels almost intentional in its assault on your body. Let's address something you've been trying not to think about. What happens if you don't make it? What if your core temperature does drop? What if you slip into moderate hypothermia and then severe hypothermia? What if dawn finds you frozen? The thought is morbid, but understanding the process might actually help you fight it, recognizing the warning signs before it's too late. Hypothermia has stages, well documented in medical literature. Mild hypothermia, core temperature 32 to 35 degrees Celsius, characterized by shivering, confusion, loss of fine motor control. You're flirting with the lower edge of normal, around 35 to 36 degrees Celsius probably. So you're in the zone. Moderate hypothermia, 28 to 32 degrees Celsius, where shivering stops, not because you're warming up but because your muscles don't have enough energy to shiver anymore, replaced by rigidity, severe confusion, drowsiness. Severe hypothermia, below 28 degrees Celsius, where you lose consciousness, heart rate drops to dangerous levels, breathing becomes shallow and irregular, and death approaches. Below 24 degrees Celsius, you're in profound hypothermia, where the heart can stop or enter lethal arrhythmias. The paradox is that people in severe hypothermia sometimes engage in behavior called paradoxical undressing, where they remove their clothing despite freezing to death. The mechanism isn't fully understood, but the theory is that as the cold paralyzes the muscles controlling vasoconstriction, blood suddenly rushes back to the periphery, creating a false sensation of intense heat. The dying person, confused and hallucinating, feels unbearably hot and strips off their protective layers, accelerating their death. Search and rescue teams in cold environments know to look for discarded clothing as a sign they're near a hypothermia victim. It's a bizarre, tragic phenomenon, and knowing about it gives you another warning sign to watch for. If you suddenly feel hot, if removing clothing seems like a good idea, that's not a sign of success. It's a terminal symptom. You're also aware of something called terminal burrowing or hide-and-die syndrome, another paradoxical behavior where hypothermic people in their final stages seek out small, enclosed spaces, crawling under beds, into closets, into narrow gaps before dying. Again, the mechanism is debated, but it might represent a final, primitive brainstem response, an attempt to protect the dying body. The fact that you've built yourself a small, enclosed space might seem darkly ironic, but your shelter was rational, constructed while you were cognitively intact. Terminal burrowing is instinctive and irrational. As long as you're aware of the difference, you can monitor your own decision-making for signs of hypothermic confusion. Your breathing is steady, controlled, and this is your anchor. As long as you can maintain breathing discipline, slow nasal inhalations, controlled exhalations, you know your brain is functioning. Breathing is both autonomic and voluntary, controlled by both brainstem and cortex, and maintaining voluntary control means your cortex is still in charge. You count breaths. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The rhythm is meditative, almost calming, and it's generating a tiny bit of additional heat through the muscular work of respiration. There's a technique from freediving called lung packing, where divers take multiple small breaths to fill their lungs beyond normal capacity, increasing oxygen supply before a dive. You can't do that here, your lungs are already working hard in the cold, but you can focus on complete breaths, filling your lungs fully, then emptying them fully, maximizing oxygen exchange. Oxygen is necessary for metabolic heat production. If your respiration becomes shallow due to cold stiffened chest muscles, your metabolism suffers. Deep breathing, paradoxically, generates more heat than shallow breathing despite the greater heat loss from increased air exchange, because the metabolic benefit outweighs the thermal cost. You're perhaps 5 hours in now, give or take, which means maybe 4 more hours until dawn. 4 hours sounds manageable when you say it quickly, but living through each minute, each cycle of shivering and pain and adjustment, makes 4 hours feel geological, like the formation of mountains or the erosion of canyons. Time has become your enemy and your ally simultaneously. Every minute survived is a victory, but every minute that must still be survived is a burden. The moss around your torso has compressed somewhat, and you wonder if it's losing effectiveness. Insulation works through loft, through trapped air, and compression eliminates loft. You try to fluff it by arching your back, creating space for the material to expand, but there's only so much you can do in the confined space. This is one advantage that modern synthetic insulation has over natural materials. Synthetics are designed to maintain loft even when wet or compressed. Your moss and bark are doing their best, but they're not optimized for this use. They're forest debris, repurposed in desperation, and the fact that they're working at all is testament to the fundamental principle that anything which traps air provides some insulation. You find yourself thinking about warmth, not just as a physical phenomenon but as a memory, a concept. You remember summer afternoons, the feeling of sun on your face, warmth so abundant that you took it for granted, even complained about heat. You remember hot showers, coffee, heated cars, rooms so warm you could sit in a t-shirt. These memories feel almost fictional now, like stories from someone else's life. The cold has become your entire reality, and warmth is an abstract idea, something theoretical that might exist but has no presence here and now. This psychological shift is dangerous because it erodes motivation. If you can't remember viscerally what warmth feels like, why fight so hard to survive to experience it again? You force yourself to engage with warm memories in detail, the specific feeling of hot water on cold hands, the exact sensation of sliding between sun-warmed sheets, the particular quality of heat from a campfire on your face. These details matter. They keep the goal concrete, keep survival purposeful rather than just reflexive. Your body continues its labor, burning fuel, generating heat, fighting the gradient. You continue your routines, checking extremities, adjusting position, breathing carefully. The night continues its slow rotation toward dawn, and somewhere out in the frozen taiga, trees crack with frost, the stars will overhead, and the cold, patient, absolute, indifferent, waits to see if you'll last. Your breathing has become the center of your universe. Each inhalation, a small victory against the cold that's trying to crystallize the moisture in your lungs. You've developed a rhythm now, a technique that's part desperation and part ancient wisdom channeled through modern understanding of physiology. You breathe in slowly through your nose, feeling the cold air warm as it passes through your nasal passages. Those convoluted turbinates inside your nose aren't just for smelling, they're radiators, warming and humidifying air before it reaches your delicate lung tissue. Then you hold briefly, letting your body extract oxygen, before exhaling even more slowly through barely parted lips, retaining as much warmth and moisture as possible. This isn't just mindfulness meditation nonsense. This is thermodynamic warfare conducted at the level of respiratory mucosa. The Saka have a traditional practice, taught to children who tend livestock in winter, called something that translates roughly as breath of the reindeer. It's based on the observation that reindeer, when bedded down in extreme cold, breathe into the snow in front of their noses, creating small caves of warmed, humidified air that they then rebreathe. The principle is reducing respiratory heat loss by not constantly exchanging your warm, moist exhalations for frigid, dry outside air. You can't exactly breathe into snow while lying in your shelter, but you've created a similar microclimate by keeping your face buried against your knees, breathing into the small pocket of air trapped there. That pocket warms slightly with each breath, maybe only to -30 degrees Celsius instead of -40 degrees Celsius. But that 10-degree difference compounds over hundreds of breaths into meaningful energy savings. There's a growing problem, though. Ice is forming on your scarf, the one you removed from your face and wrapped around your boots hours ago. Or maybe it's frost on the moss near your face. Or possibly it's crystallization of moisture on the inner surface of your jacket where your breath has leaked upward. You can feel it, a stiffness in the fabric, a crackling texture that wasn't there before. This is moisture management failure, and it's one of the great killers in extreme cold. Every breath you exhale contains water vapor. Warm air holds more moisture than cold air, so as your breath cools, that moisture condenses and freezes. In a normal cold weather situation with proper gear, you have vents and baffles to manage this moisture, allowing it to escape before it freezes in your insulation. In your jury-rigged shelter with improvised insulation, you have no such system. The moisture is accumulating, freezing, and gradually reducing the effectiveness of your clothing and shelter. Mountaineers call this icing up, and it's a well-documented hazard on high-altitude expeditions. Edmund Hillary's team on Everest in 1953 dealt with it. Modern climbers on Denali deal with it. Anyone who sleeps in extreme cold without a properly designed system deals with it. The moisture doesn't just come from breathing, it also comes from insensible perspiration, the constant low-level evaporation of water through your skin that happens even when you're not actively sweating. You're wrapped in layers, lying in a confined space, and your body is generating moisture that has nowhere to go. It freezes in place, adding weight, reducing loft, and gradually transforming your insulation from fluffy and effective to compressed and conductive. You need to do something about this, but your options are limited. You can't remove layers to shake out the ice. Exposing yourself to minus 40 degrees Celsius air while you clean your clothing would be suicidal. You can't generate enough heat to melt the moisture and dry things out. What you can do is try to minimize additional moisture accumulation. You adjust your breathing pattern slightly, trying to direct your exhalations away from your clothing, breathing more directly into the small air gap at your shelter entrance. This means your face gets colder. The trade-off is inevitable, but it might reduce icing. You also force yourself to relax more, to reduce any metabolic heat production beyond what's absolutely necessary. Because the warmer you are, the more you'll sweat insensibly. It's counterintuitive. You need to stay warm to survive, but you also need to avoid creating the moisture that will eventually make you colder. The numbness in your toes has progressed to a point where you're genuinely unsure if they're still attached. This sounds dramatic, but it's accurate. You've lost all sensation below your ankles, and when you try to flex your toes, you can't tell if they're responding. Your feet are still in your boots, obviously, but are your toes still viable inside those boots? This is the nightmare scenario of frostbite. The injury occurs hidden from view, irreversible damage accumulating while you lie helpless. You know the protocol. You should remove your boots, check your toes visually, warm them against your core. But you also know that removing your boots is incredibly risky. Boots protect your feet from the cold ground. If you drop a boot in the dark, if you can't get your frozen feet back into frozen boots, you've just transformed a maybe frostbite situation into a definitely frozen feet situation. You compromise. You work your hands down along your legs, outside your clothing, until you can feel your boots. Through your mittens and the boot material, you can't feel much, but you press and probe, trying to determine if your feet are at least present, if the boots are still on properly. Everything seems intact, which is reassuring but not definitive. You make a mental commitment. You'll check your toes at first light, as soon as you have enough visibility to see what you're doing. Until then, you'll continue the flexing exercises, working on faith that the muscles and tendons are responding even though you can't feel them. Historians still argue whether traditional Saka footwear was superior to modern boots for extreme cold, and the debate reveals interesting cultural assumptions about technology and progress. Modern boots use advanced materials: closed-cell foam insulation, vapor barriers, synthetic insulation that maintains loft when compressed. Traditional Ederbus used reindeer hide, dried grass, and sometimes birch bark. By laboratory measurements, modern boots should win better R values, more consistent performance. But the traditional boots had one huge advantage: repairability and customization. If grass got wet, you replaced it. If your feet swelled or shrank due to cold, you adjusted the grass packing. If moisture accumulated, you could disassemble the entire boot, dry everything, and rebuild it. Modern boots are sealed systems. Once moisture gets into the insulation layer, it stays there, progressively degrading performance until you can dry the entire boot in a heated room. There's no objectively right answer, just trade-offs, but lying here with numb feet, you're thinking maybe the Saka approach had merits that don't show up in laboratory testing. Your shivering has changed character. Instead of waves, it's become almost continuous. a background tremor that never quite stops, just varies in intensity. This is concerning because continuous shivering indicates your body is struggling to maintain core temperature, having shifted from periodic shivering as a warning system to constant shivering as a last-line defense. Your muscles are burning through fuel at a ferocious rate now, and you can feel the metabolic consequences. A deep, cellular exhaustion that's different from mere tiredness. Your body is running on fumes, breaking down whatever energy reserves it can access, and the math is simple. If dawn doesn't come before those reserves run out, you enter moderate hypothermia, and from there it's a short slide to severe hypothermia and death. To combat the exhaustion and the creeping cold, you try controlled shivering, tensing specific muscle groups deliberately to generate heat, then relaxing them before they cramp. Quads first. Tense, hold for 10 seconds, feel the burn, release. Glutes. Clench, hold, release. Core. Draw your belly button toward your spine. Hold, release. This is exhausting in its own way, but it's more efficient than uncontrolled shivering, giving you some agency over the process. Between sets, you rest, breathing carefully, monitoring your body for feedback. There's a phenomenon in extreme cold survival called metabolic winter, where the body attempts to reduce its energy expenditure by essentially shutting down non-essential functions. Heart rate slows, digestion stops, cognitive function becomes sluggish. It's not hibernation, humans can't truly hibernate, but it's a similar strategy, a recognition by your body that energy is finite and must be rationed. You can feel this happening now. Your thoughts are slower, taking longer to form and execute. Your heart, which was pounding earlier from stress and effort, has settled into a slow, heavy rhythm. Time continues its distortion, and you find yourself losing track of whether you've been monitoring your extremities for 5 minutes or 30. You shake your head sharply, trying to clear the fog, and pain shoots through your neck. Muscles stiff from cold and immobility. The pain is clarifying, almost welcome. Pain means you're alive, means nerve function remains intact. You catalog your pain inventory. Aching hips, screaming shoulders, throbbing hands, mysterious numbness in feet, burning sinuses from cold air, sharp pain in cheekbones. It's comprehensive, a whole-body orchestra of discomfort, and perversely, this is good news. When the pain stops, when you slip into comfortable numbness throughout, that's when you're in real trouble. That's when hypothermia has progressed far enough to dull pain perception, to make you feel warm and drowsy, to invite you to just close your eyes and rest. You remember something from a survival story? Was it Joe Simpson in Touching the Void? Or Beck Weathers on Everest? Or maybe one of the Antarctic explorers? About using anger to stay alive. When exhaustion and cold made rational survival seem impossible, anger provided fuel. Anger at the situation, at the universe, at the cold itself. You try to summon anger now, to kindle some hot emotion that might translate into metabolic heat. But you're too tired for anger. What you feel instead is something like stubborn spite. A refusal to give the cold the satisfaction of killing you. A determination to last until dawn out of sheer bloody-mindedness. It's not noble or heroic. It's petty and small. But petty spite has kept people alive before, and maybe it'll work now. Your breath control wavers, and you catch yourself breathing rapidly, shallowly, almost panting. This is bad. Hyperventilation in extreme cold can cause you to blow off too much CO2, alkalinizing your blood and triggering muscle cramps and dizziness. You force yourself back to slow, deep breathing, but it's harder now, requiring conscious effort where before it was becoming automatic. This is cognitive fatigue, decision fatigue, the exhaustion of maintaining perfect discipline for hours on end. Every decision costs energy. Whether to adjust position, whether to warm your hands now or wait 10 more minutes, whether to flex your toes again, whether to eat a bit more snow for hydration. The decisions seem endless, and each one requires a mental effort that's increasingly difficult to muster. Let's talk about what's happening in your extremities right now, because understanding the process might help you make better decisions about managing it. When tissue begins to freeze, it doesn't happen uniformly. First, the extracellular fluid, the liquid between cells, freezes because it has a slightly higher freezing point than intracellular fluid due to lower solute concentration. As this extracellular ice forms, it creates a hyperosmolar environment, pulling water out of cells through osmosis. The cells dehydrate and shrink, their membranes crenellating and potentially rupturing. Meanwhile, the growing ice crystals mechanically compress and damage tissue structures. If you catch it early and rewarm slowly, the cells can rehydrate and recover. If it progresses too far, or if you rewarm too quickly causing rapid ice melting and severe osmotic stress, the cells die. The necrosis takes days to become fully apparent. Initially, frostbitten tissue looks pale and waxy, then it becomes swollen and purple as blood flow returns. Then it turns black over the course of days or weeks as dead tissue mummifies. Your toes are in some stage of this process right now, and you won't know which stage until you can see them. Best case: frost nip, superficial freezing, completely reversible. Likely case: first-degree frostbite, some cellular damage but most tissue viable. Worst case: deep frostbite with extensive tissue death. The outcome depends on how long they've been frozen, how deep the freeze has penetrated, and how you manage the eventual rewarming. For now, all you can do is try to keep them from getting worse, try to maintain some blood flow to them through your flexing exercises, and hope. There's a ringing in your ears now, a high-pitched tone that appeared gradually and has become persistent. This is probably vascular, restricted blood flow to your inner ear, or perhaps just the sound of profound silence in a way that your auditory system isn't equipped to process. Human hearing evolved in noisy environments. True silence is alien to our neurology, and the brain sometimes generates phantom sounds to fill the void. Tinnitus is common in extreme cold exposure, sometimes temporary, sometimes persistent. You try to ignore it, to focus on other sensations, but it's insistent, a reminder that your body is operating under conditions it was never designed for. You think about Wim Hof, the Dutch extreme athlete who's climbed Everest in shorts and run a marathon above the Arctic Circle barefoot. He claims that through breathing techniques and mental conditioning, he can control his autonomic nervous system, can maintain core temperature in conditions that should cause hypothermia. Scientists have studied him and found that yes, he does show unusual cold tolerance, though whether it's replicable or just his unique physiology remains debated. Right now, you'd give anything for a fraction of his ability. But you're not Wim Hof. You're an ordinary human with ordinary physiology, attempting something that ordinary humans aren't meant to survive. The fact that you've lasted this long is already remarkable. The question is whether remarkable is enough. Your hands need warming again, and this time when you pull them into your armpits, the pain is different. Less sharp, more of a deep ache that doesn't quite resolve even after several minutes of warming. This could be progressive cold injury, or it could be simple exhaustion of the pain response, nerve fatigue from hours of repeated cold exposure. You flex your fingers against your ribs, feeling the stiffness, the reluctance of tendons and joints to move smoothly. Later, if there is a later, you'll deal with whatever damage has been done. Right now, you focus on maintaining enough function to keep managing your survival. Dawn is still hours away, and those hours stretch before you like an Arctic desert, vast and empty and pitiless. But you've made it this far. Your body, for all its complaints and warnings, is still functioning. Your mind, though fatigued, remains basically clear. You're not warm, not comfortable, not safe, but you're alive, and alive is all that matters until the sun rises. Time has collapsed into something non-linear, a series of disconnected moments that might be minutes or hours apart. You genuinely cannot tell anymore. You exist in a perpetual now that's stretched thin and fragile, where the past is just earlier cold, and the future is just continued cold until dawn, maybe. Your watch, buried somewhere under layers of moss-stuffed clothing, might as well be on another planet. The position of stars, normally a reliable indicator for anyone with basic navigation knowledge, is invisible to you in your snow tomb. You have no reference points, no external markers, just the internal sense of endurance and the question that repeats with increasing urgency. How much longer? The hallucinations have started, though you're reluctant to call them that because they're not visual, there's still no light to see by, and they're not exactly auditory either. They're more like presence hallucinations, the sense that you're not alone in your shelter. You feel like someone is lying behind you, pressed against your back, and part of your brain knows this is impossible. Your shelter is barely large enough for you, let alone another person. But the sensation is so convincing that you actually reach back with one mittened hand to check. There's nothing there, of course, just the wall of packed snow and the moss-stuffed bulk of your own clothing. But 30 seconds later, the feeling returns. Someone is definitely behind you, breathing quietly, radiating warmth. This is your brain in crisis, trying to make sense of sensory deprivation, stress, and the early stages of cold-induced cognitive impairment. The phenomenon has been reported by solo Arctic explorers, by mountaineers in death zones, by sailors adrift at sea. The brain, evolved for social interaction and communal survival, apparently doesn't handle profound isolation well and sometimes manufactures companions. Some researchers think it's related to sleep deprivation and hallucinations. Others suggest it's a misinterpretation of your own body signals. The feeling of pressure against your back might be your own muscles tensing, misattributed by a confused sensory cortex. Whatever the mechanism, it's deeply unsettling, and you have to keep reminding yourself. You are alone, there is no one else here, the presence you feel is not real. Except, part of you wishes it were real. A companion would mean shared body heat, someone to talk to, someone to take shifts monitoring for problems while the other rests. The Saka had the right idea with their communal winter survival strategies. Families stayed together in their balagans. Hunters traveled in groups. Even reindeer herders, who spent long periods alone with their herds, had the animals for companionship and, in dire emergencies, for warmth. You could kill a reindeer, gut it, and climb inside the still warm carcass. A gruesome but effective emergency shelter that has saved lives. You have none of this. You're attempting something that traditional Saka culture would have considered not brave but foolish. Solo winter survival without fire, without proper shelter, without the accumulated wisdom of group decision-making. Your breathing technique is faltering. You keep catching yourself taking rapid, shallow breaths, panting almost before remembering to slow down, to breathe deeply and deliberately. Each time you correct yourself, it takes more mental effort. This is what hypothermia does to executive function. It erodes your ability to maintain consistent behavior, to stick to protocols, to override automatic responses with reasoned ones. You're fighting a battle on two fronts. Against the external cold that's trying to freeze your tissue, and against the internal cold that's trying to fog your brain. The second front might actually be more dangerous because if you lose cognitive function, you'll make fatal mistakes even if your body is still technically capable of surviving. Let's discuss what's happening in your brain specifically, because the neuroscience of hypothermia is both well-studied and deeply disturbing. Your brain is an incredibly energy-hungry organ, consuming about 20% of your body's total energy budget despite being only 2% of your body weight. It's also extremely temperature sensitive. As your core temperature drops, even just a degree or two below normal, cerebral metabolism slows. Neurotransmitter release becomes sluggish. Electrical signaling in neurons becomes less efficient. The blood-brain barrier, which normally protects your brain from toxins, can become leaky, allowing potentially harmful substances to enter neural tissue. And perhaps most critically, your brain's ability to regulate its own temperature becomes impaired. The hypothalamus, which monitors and maintains body temperature, starts making errors in judgment, sometimes interpreting cold as heat or shutting down thermoregulatory responses entirely. The result is a cascade of cognitive symptoms. First comes difficulty with complex reasoning. You can still think, but abstract thought becomes harder, problem-solving takes longer. Then comes memory impairment. You forget what you were just thinking about, you lose track of time, you can't remember if you warmed your hands 10 minutes ago or an hour ago. Then comes disorientation, confusion about where you are, why you're here, what you're supposed to be doing. And finally, in severe hypothermia, comes complete disorientation and loss of consciousness. You're somewhere in the early to middle stages of this progression. You're still oriented, you know you're in Yakutia in a snow shelter trying to survive until dawn. But the edges are fuzzy, and maintaining clarity requires constant effort. You force yourself through a cognitive self-assessment, a mental status exam you're administering to yourself. Name, you remember your name. Date, it's January 2025, probably the 22nd or 23rd depending on how long you've been here. Location, Yakutia, Siberia, Russia. Situation, survival challenge, no fire, extreme cold. Task, stay alive until dawn. The fact that you can answer these questions is encouraging. You're not severely impaired yet. But you're also aware that people with cognitive impairment often lack insight into their impairment, a phenomenon called anosognosia. You might be more confused than you realize. This metacognitive loop, worrying about whether you're too impaired to recognize your impairment, is itself exhausting, but you can't afford to stop monitoring yourself. Your body has found a new way to hurt you: muscle cramps. They start in your calves, sudden vicious spasms that lock the muscles in painful contraction. You try to stretch, but there's no room in your confined shelter to extend your legs fully. You press your toes, or what you hope are your toes. Still can't feel them, against the end of your shelter, and push, trying to lengthen the calf muscles, but the cold has made your tendons stiff and reluctant to stretch. The cramp persists for what feels like minutes, a knot of agony in your lower leg, before finally releasing. 30 seconds later, the other calf cramps, then your thigh, then, horrifyingly, your diaphragm seizes, making it difficult to breathe for several seconds before the spasm releases. These cramps are multifactorial. Cold makes muscles more prone to cramping, dehydration contributes. You've been rationing your snowmelting because of the metabolic cost. And electrolyte imbalances from stress and inadequate nutrition don't help. But they're also a sign of your muscles operating at their limits, fatigued from hours of shivering and isometric tensing, depleted of glycogen and accumulating metabolic waste products that can't be efficiently cleared due to vasoconstriction. Your muscles are staging small rebellions, and you have no way to effectively manage it except to wait out each cramp and hope it doesn't happen somewhere critical. A severe cramp in your chest or abdomen could impair your breathing enough to cause problems. A cramp in your jaw could make it difficult to breathe through your mouth if your nose becomes too congested with frozen mucus. Speaking of which, your nasal passages are in rough shape. The membranes inside your nose are dried out, cracked, and bleeding slightly. You can taste blood at the back of your throat, a metallic tang that appears periodically. This is rhinitis sicca, dry nose inflammation, caused by prolonged exposure to cold, dry air. In extreme cases, it can lead to nosebleeds severe enough to be dangerous, though that's rare. More commonly, it just means discomfort, scabbing, and increased vulnerability to respiratory infections later. The indigenous peoples of the Arctic used various remedies for this. Seal oil applied to nasal membranes to provide lubrication and protection, herbal preparations with anti-inflammatory properties, and in some cultures, the practice of breathing through a scarf or mask that trapped moisture and warmed incoming air. You have none of these interventions available, so you're just enduring the damage and hoping it doesn't get worse. There's a sound outside, or you think there's a sound. It's hard to tell because the ringing in your ears has intensified, and you're not sure if you're hearing something real or if your auditory cortex is inventing stimuli. But it sounds like footsteps, crunching in snow. You freeze, listening intently. The sound continues. Crunch, 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 rhythmic and deliberate. Something is walking near your shelter. Your heart rate spikes. Not the slow, conserved rhythm you've been maintaining, but suddenly pounding, fight or flight activated. What could be walking around at night in minus 71 degrees Celsius Yakutia? The rational part of your brain runs through options. Reindeer, maybe, though they usually don't move much in extreme cold. Wolves? Possible, though they also tend to den up during the worst cold. Wolverines are active year-round, but unlikely in this area. Person? Absurdly unlikely. Who else would be out here, now, in these conditions? The sound continues, circling your shelter, and you realize with a mix of relief and embarrassment that it's probably frost quakes. Those tree-cracking sounds you heard earlier, but your disoriented brain is interpreting them as footsteps. Sound localization is difficult in extreme cold because temperature gradients bend sound waves, making it hard to determine direction and distance. What sounds like footsteps right outside your shelter might actually be trees cracking 100 meters away. Or maybe you're hallucinating the entire thing. Auditory hallucinations are common in sensory deprivation and hypothermia. Your brain, starved for input, is creating its own. This is less comforting than the rational explanation, but it might be more accurate. Either way, there's nothing you can do about it. You can't investigate. Leaving your shelter would be fatal. You can't defend yourself, you have no weapons, and even if you did, your hands are too cold and clumsy to use them effectively. You can only lie here, listening, trying to determine what's real and what's your brain's invention, and hoping that if something dangerous is out there, it loses interest and moves on. The footsteps, real or imagined, fade away, and you're left with just the ringing in your ears and your own breathing. Your heart rate slowly decreases back to its sluggish, cold-adapted rhythm. You realize you've been tensing every muscle in your body, burning precious energy on an adrenaline response to a probably imaginary threat. This is another way the cold kills, by triggering stress responses that burn through your energy reserves faster. Every spike of fear, every moment of panic, every surge of adrenaline is fuel you can't afford to waste. You try to calm yourself using a technique from meditation. Body scan relaxation, systematically releasing tension from each muscle group. Start with your face. Relax your jaw, which you've been clenching unconsciously. Relax your shoulders, which are hunched up around your ears. Relax your hands, which are balled into fists inside your mittens. Move down through your body. Chest, abdomen, thighs, calves. Some muscles won't relax. They're locked in cold-induced tension or actively shivering, but even partial relaxation helps. It reduces metabolic demand, conserves energy, and maybe, just maybe, keeps you rational for a bit longer. Historians still argue whether the Saka concept of Aya, loosely translated as spirit or vital force, represented a proto-scientific understanding of metabolism and energy balance, or was purely spiritual. The traditional belief was that every person had Aya that needed to be maintained through proper diet, rest, and protection from cold. When Aya was depleted, the person became weak, sick, or died. Modern science would call this metabolic energy balance and thermoregulation, but the conceptual framework is similar. You have a finite reserve that's being depleted, and if it runs out before dawn, you die. Your Aya, your vital force, your metabolic reserves, whatever you call it, is running low. You can feel the depletion as a cellular exhaustion, a heaviness that's more profound than simple tiredness. Your body is consuming itself to stay warm, and there's only so much of yourself available to consume. Another cramp, this time in your foot. At least you think it's your foot, though you still can't feel your toes distinctly. The sensation is of deep, twisting pain somewhere in the region of your arch, and you try to flex and point to release it, but you're not sure if your muscles are responding to your commands. The disconnect between intention and sensation is terrifying. You will your toes to move, and maybe they do, maybe they don't. You have no feedback, no confirmation. For all you know, your feet are frozen solid below the ankle, and all your flexing exercises have been pantomime, signals sent to dead tissue that can't respond. This thought spirals into anxiety that you have to forcibly contain. Catastrophizing won't help. You need to stay focused on what you can control. Breathing, position management, hand warming, cognitive monitoring. Your feet are either viable or they're not, and you'll find out at dawn. Until then, worrying about them serves no purpose except to elevate your stress hormones and burn more energy. You breathe deeply, carefully, trying to activate your parasympathetic nervous system, trying to shift from fight or flight into rest and digest, even though there's nothing to digest and no safety to rest in. The phantom presence behind you returns, stronger this time. You can almost feel breath on the back of your neck, body heat radiating against your spine. It's so convincing that you actually speak aloud, your voice a cracked whisper, "I know you're not real." Saying it helps somehow. Acknowledging the hallucination robs it of some power. The presence doesn't disappear, but it becomes less insistent, shifting from "someone is definitely here" to "I feel like someone is here." It's a subtle difference, but it represents maintaining your grip on reality. Refusing to let hypothermic confusion erase the boundary between real and imagined. Time stretches, contracts, disappears entirely for periods where you exist in a state that's not quite sleep but isn't fully conscious either. A hypothermic fugue state where your brain is conserving energy by dimming non-essential functions. You surface from these periods with a jolt of fear, forcing yourself back to alertness, checking your extremities, assessing your cognitive state. Each time you surface, it's a little harder to clear the fog, a little more tempting to just sink back into that dim, almost comfortable state. But that state, is dangerous. That state is where people slip from mild hypothermia into moderate hypothermia, from survivable into critical. Dawn has to be coming. It has to be. You've been here forever. endured infinitely, and dawn has to be approaching. But you have no way to know. The darkness is absolute. The cold is unchanging. And your grip on time is so tenuous that for all you know, only 3 hours have passed, and you have 6 more to go. That thought is unbearable, so you push it away, focusing instead on the next small task. Warm hands, flex toes, breathe, survive to the next moment, and then the next. The isolation is eating at you now in ways that pure physical cold cannot. You're beginning to understand that surviving extreme cold alone is fundamentally different from surviving it with others. Not just because of practical advantages like shared body heat or taking turns staying alert, but because of something deeper, something psychological that you weren't prepared for. Humans are social primates, evolved for group living, and your brain is wired with circuitry that expects other people to be present, especially in threatening situations. When that circuitry fires and finds nothing, no voices, no touch, no presence, it starts to malfunction in subtle and not so subtle ways. The phantom companion you've been sensing is just the most obvious symptom. Underneath that, there's a growing sense of unreality, a feeling that maybe this entire situation is a dream or hallucination, that maybe you don't exist at all, that maybe the cold has already won and what you're experiencing now is some kind of dying brain fantasy. You have to fight this. You speak aloud again, forcing your voice to work despite a throat raw from cold air. I am here. I am real. This is real. I will survive until dawn. The words come out slurred. Your tongue is sluggish, your lips stiff, but hearing your own voice helps anchor you to reality. It's proof of existence, proof of agency. You are not a passive victim being acted upon by cold. You are an active participant in your own survival, making choices, executing strategies, enduring with intention. The distinction matters psychologically. Studies of survival situations, from prisoner of war camps to natural disasters, consistently show that people who maintain a sense of agency, who believe their actions matter, survive at higher rates than people who become passive and fatalistic. So you give yourself tasks, concrete actions to maintain that agency. Task 1. Inventory your body systematically. Start at your head and work down. Scalp. Cold but intact, protected by hat and hood and moss. Face. Numb, especially nose and cheeks, but you've been managing them. Neck. Aching from position but functional. Shoulders. Screaming with muscle tension. Arms, cold, shivering. Hands. Cycling through painful to numb to painful again, but still responsive when warmed. Chest. Shivering, that continuous tremor, but core temperature probably still marginally adequate. Abdomen. Empty, that hollow feeling that's part hunger and part metabolic exhaustion. Hips. Bruised and aching from lying on hard surface. Thighs. Shivering, cramping periodically. Knees. Stiff. Lower legs cold. Feet. Unknown, the great terrible unknown, possibly frozen, possibly fine, no way to tell. Task 2. Review your survival strategy and adjust if needed. Your shelter is adequate, not good, but adequate. Your insulation is degrading somewhat as moisture freezes in your clothing, but it's still providing critical protection. Your breathing technique is helping minimize respiratory heat loss. Your periodic warming of extremities is probably preventing the worst frostbite on your hands and face. Your feet are the vulnerability you can't address without unacceptable risk. Decision. Maintain current strategy. No changes. The plan, such as it is working well enough to keep you alive so far. Task 3. Estimate time until dawn. This is nearly impossible without external references, but you try anyway. You've been in the shelter for a long time. Hours. Many hours. If you went into the shelter around sunset, which was perhaps 4 p.m. given the latitude and season, and dawn comes around 10 a.m., that's 18 hours of darkness. But you spent time building the shelter before full darkness, so maybe you've been in here for 10 hours? 12? The math is fuzzy, and you realize you're making assumptions that could be wildly wrong. But if you've been here for 10 or 12 hours, that means only 6 to 8 hours remain. That feels survivable. That feels like a goal you can reach. You cling to this estimate even though you know it might be fantasy because hope, even false hope, has metabolic value. Let's talk about the psychology of solo endurance because there's actually research on this, mostly from polar explorers and solo sailors. When humans are isolated in threatening environments for extended periods, they develop characteristic psychological responses. The first is hypervigilance, constant monitoring for threats, inability to relax, which you've been experiencing. The second is time distortion, which you're definitely experiencing. The third is what researchers call the third man factor or sense presence. That feeling of an invisible companion, sometimes comforting, sometimes threatening. The fourth is heightened emotional lability. Rapid swings between hope and despair, between determination and the urge to give up. And the fifth, in extreme cases, is dissociation, a sense of watching yourself from outside, of being disconnected from your body and situation. You're experiencing several of these, but you're still on the functional side of the spectrum. The key is recognizing the symptoms for what they are, stress responses, not reality, and not letting them drive your decision-making. When you feel despair rising, when the temptation to just stop trying becomes overwhelming, you need to recognize it as a psychological symptom, not an accurate assessment of your situation. You're probably in rough shape, yes, but you're not dead yet, and as long as you're not dead, survival is possible. A new sensation, itching. Intense, maddening itching on your back, your sides, your legs, everywhere the moss is pressed against your skin through your base layers. This is probably a combination of factors. Dry skin from dehydration and cold, mild irritation from the rough organic material, and possibly a histamine response as your body reacts to prolonged contact with foreign matter. Or maybe it's formication, the sensation of insects crawling on or under your skin, which is a known symptom of hypothermia and dehydration. Whatever the cause, it's driving you crazy. You want to scratch? Desperately? But accessing your skin would mean exposing yourself to the minus 40 degrees Celsius interior air, and the relief of scratching wouldn't be worth the heat loss and frostbite risk. So you endure the itching, adding it to your catalog of discomforts. At this point, you're basically a walking, or rather lying, inventory of everything that can go wrong with a human body in extreme cold. Pain, numbness, cramps, itching, exhaustion, hunger, thirst, sensory hallucinations, cognitive fog, and probably a dozen things you're not even aware of because your brain has given up reporting every little problem. This is actually adaptive in its own way. If your consciousness had to process every signal of distress your body is sending, you'd be overwhelmed and unable to function. Your brain is triaging, reporting only the most critical issues and suppressing the rest. The itching apparently didn't make the cut as critical, which is why it's being filtered through. Or maybe your brain is just screwing with you at this point. Hard to say. You hear the tree cracking sounds again, those frost quakes echoing across the taiga, and this time you don't mistake them for footsteps. You've learned to interpret the soundscape of extreme cold. The sharp cracks are trees, the settling sounds are your snow shelter compacting slightly, the high-pitched ringing is your ears, the whooshing sound is your blood flowing past your eardrums. And underneath it all, silence. Not absence of sound exactly, but a quality of quiet that's profound and almost oppressive, the silence of a landscape where nothing moves, nothing breathes, nothing lives except you and your desperate clinging to existence. Historians still argue whether the traditional saka practice of kurek, ritual storytelling during long winter nights, served a purely social function, or whether it had survival value. The stories were long, elaborate, often continuing over multiple nights, and they required active participation from listeners who would interject, ask questions, and contribute their own variations. Modern researchers recognize that this practice kept people cognitively engaged during periods of enforced immobility, preventing the mental deterioration that can accompany isolation and inactivity. It also created social bonds and maintained community coherence through the difficult winter months. You have no stories being told to you, no community, so you try to tell yourself stories, to narrate your own situation as if you were recounting it later to friends. So there I was, lying in a snow hole in Yakutia, stuffed with moss like some kind of scarecrow, my feet possibly frozen, my hands cycling through stages of agony, and I thought to myself, but you lose the thread, can't maintain the narrative, and lapse back into silence. The shivering has evolved again. Now it comes in violent bursts, 30 seconds of intense, whole body shaking that rattles your teeth and makes your shelter's snow walls vibrate, followed by periods of relative stillness where only your core trembles slightly. This pattern is concerning because it suggests your body is struggling to maintain core temperature and is deploying shivering in increasingly desperate bursts. Each burst generates heat but costs enormous energy, and the diminishing returns are becoming apparent. Your body can only sustain this pattern for so long before glycogen stores are completely exhausted and shivering stops. Not because you're warmer, but because you've run out of fuel. You need to do something to reduce your heat loss, to shift the balance even slightly in your favor. You consider your options with a brain that's moving slowly but still functional. You could compress yourself into an even tighter fetal position, reducing surface area. You could try to add more moss insulation, though reaching outside to gather it would cost heat and you're not sure you have the dexterity left. You could block the ventilation gap more completely, though that risks carbon dioxide buildup. Each option has trade-offs, and you're having trouble weighing them clearly. You decide on the simplest intervention: tighter fetal position. You draw your knees up as close to your chest as they'll go, wrap your arms around your shins, and tuck your head down, creating the most compact shape you can manage. The position is uncomfortable, you're already aching hips and back protest violently, but it reduces your surface area by maybe 10 or 15%, and in thermodynamic terms, that's significant. Less surface area means less heat loss. You try to maintain this position, fighting against the cramping muscles and the urge to stretch, breathing shallowly because deep breaths are difficult with your torso compressed. Time passes, or doesn't pass. It's hard to tell. You exist in your compressed ball of cold and pain, breathing, shivering, enduring. The phantom presence returns stronger now, and this time, instead of feeling like someone behind you, it feels like you're being embraced. Arms around you, warmth against your back and chest simultaneously, as if you're surrounded by body heat. It's so convincing, so comforting, that you almost let yourself believe it. This is dangerous territory, you know. Comforting hallucinations in hypothermia often precede the final stages: the paradoxical undressing, the terminal burrowing, the last confused actions before death. But the sensation is so pleasant compared to the hours of cold that you allow yourself to enjoy it for just a moment, knowing it's false but grateful for the psychological relief it provides. Then you force yourself back to reality with a sharp mental shake. Not real, you whisper. Hallucination. Hypothermia symptom. Stay alert. The embrace sensation fades somewhat, though it doesn't disappear entirely. Your brain, it seems, is going to keep offering you this comforting fiction whether you want it or not. You'll just have to maintain awareness that it's fiction, walking a tightrope between the psychological comfort it provides and the danger of believing it fully. Your thoughts turn morbid. What if you don't make it? What if dawn comes but you're too damaged to function, too cold to move, too far gone to save yourself even with sunlight? What if your feet are frozen and you can't walk out of here? What if your cognitive impairment has progressed further than you realize and you're already in moderate hypothermia, just lucid enough to worry about it but not functional enough to survive it? These thoughts spiral, gaining momentum, and you have to actively interrupt them. Stop, you say aloud. Catastrophizing. Not helpful. Focus on now. You're alive now. That's what matters. But the thoughts have triggered something. Fear. Real visceral fear that sits in your stomach like ice. You've been operating on determination and stubbornness, pushing through without really acknowledging how precarious your situation is. But now, maybe 10 or 12 or 14 hours into this ordeal, with dawn still hours away, the reality crashes in. You might actually die here. This might be how your story ends. Frozen in a snow hole in Siberia, stuffed with moss, alone. The fear is almost paralyzing, threatening to overwhelm your carefully maintained composure. You fight it with anger, that resource you tried to tap earlier. You summon rage at the cold, at the situation, at the universe for putting you here, at yourself for attempting this insane challenge. The anger is hot and energizing, a brief surge of warmth that seems to push back the cold just slightly. I will not die here, you say through gritted teeth, your voice stronger now. I refuse. The cold doesn't get to win. Dawn is coming and I will see it. I will survive this. This bravado may be false bravado, but it serves its purpose. The fear recedes, not gone but manageable, and you return to your routines. Check hands? Flex toes? Probably. Still can't feel them. Breathe carefully, endure. The night continues, infinite and absolute. But you continue to, moment by moment, breath by breath, choosing survival with each second that passes. And somewhere beyond the snow and darkness, the Earth continues its rotation, carrying this frozen spot toward dawn with the inevitability of celestial mechanics. You just have to last long enough to meet it. Something is changing. You're not sure what exactly, but there's a shift in the quality of your experience that you can't quite identify. At first you think it might be another hallucination, another trick of your hypothermic brain, but then you realize the darkness doesn't feel quite as absolute. You blink, test your eyes, and yes, there's a difference. Not light, exactly, not yet, but the darkness has shifted from the pure, utter blackness that erases all visual information to something slightly less complete. It's still dark, overwhelmingly dark, but it's the darkness of very early pre-dawn rather than the void of deep night. This might be wishful thinking, or it might be real. You desperately hope it's real. If it is real, if dawn is truly approaching, you've made it through the worst. The coldest part of the night is traditionally just before dawn, when the Earth has radiated heat all night without any solar input to replace it, when temperatures drop to their absolute minimum. You should be at your coldest and most vulnerable right now. But you're still conscious, still breathing, still capable of thought. Damaged, yes, almost certainly damaged, but alive. The realization brings a complicated surge of emotion. Relief, gratitude, triumph, and underneath it all, a bone-deep exhaustion that threatens to shut you down now that the end might be in sight. You want to relax, to let your guard down, but this is exactly when people die. There are documented cases of survivors who made it through terrible ordeals only to die in the last hour, either because they relaxed too soon and made fatal errors, or because their bodies, running on pure adrenaline and willpower, simply gave out once the immediate threat seemed past. You force yourself to maintain vigilance. Dawn approaching doesn't mean dawn arrived. You still need to manage your extremities, still need to monitor for hypothermia symptoms, still need to keep breathing carefully and maintaining what's left of your core heat. But you allow yourself one concession to hope. You begin planning your exit from the shelter. When there's enough light to see, real light, enough to assess your condition and navigate, you'll need to move carefully and methodically. First priority will be checking your feet, determining whether they're frostbitten and if so, how badly. Second priority will be getting out of the shelter without causing a collapse that could bury you in snow. Third priority will be assessing your mobility. Can you walk? Can you move? Can you get yourself to safety, or will you need to stay put and hope for rescue? These plans are contingent on so many unknowns, but having a plan, even a rough one, gives you something to focus on besides pain and cold. The darkness continues its imperceptible lightning. You might be imagining it. Your eyes have been dark adapted for so many hours that they might be inventing signals that aren't there. But you hope that the change is real. Time still has that elastic quality, but now instead of stretching endlessly, it seems to be accelerating slightly, as if reality itself is eager to reach dawn and end this ordeal. You resist looking at where the entrance gap in your shelter is. Resist the temptation to search for light, because disappointment would be crushing. Instead, you focus inward, continuing your body maintenance routines, being a good steward of your failing flesh. Your hands go into your armpits again, and this time the pain is different. Less sharp, more diffuse, and slow to build. This could mean improved circulation, or it could mean progressive nerve damage, reducing pain sensation. You flex your fingers and feel stiffness, resistance, but also movement. Your hands are damaged, but probably not catastrophically. You'll lose some tissue, fingertips most likely, maybe patches of skin on your palms, but you'll keep your fingers. Probably. You make a mental note to be careful with your hands in the next few hours. Damaged tissue is extremely vulnerable to further injury, and a second freeze-thaw cycle would be devastating. Now for the moment you've been dreading, assessing your feet. You've kept them essentially immobilized for hours, flexing occasionally but not truly checking their condition. Now you try to move them deliberately. Left foot, you send the signal to wiggle toes, and something happens. You can't feel it, can't confirm sensation, but there's a change in pressure against your boot that suggests movement occurred. Right foot, same thing. Movement probably, but no sensation. This is not good, but also not worst case. Worst case would be no movement at all, frozen solid, tissue death certain. What you have is severe frostbite with nerve involvement, probably deep first degree or possibly second degree, which means pain and tissue loss and a long recovery, but also means your feet are still structurally intact, still potentially functional. The light is definitely growing now. You can see the outline of your shelter's entrance, a lighter gray against the darker gray of the snow walls. It's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, that faint distinction between shades of gray. Dawn is coming. You've survived the night. The knowledge brings tears, actual tears, which freeze on your cheeks almost instantly, tiny tracks of ice running from the corners of your eyes. You reach up with a mittened hand and brush them away, feeling the ice crystals break and fall. Let's talk about what dawn means physiologically and practically, because surviving to see it doesn't automatically mean surviving the aftermath. First, you need to avoid rapid rewarming, which sounds counterintuitive but is critical. Frozen tissue that's rewarmed too quickly undergoes catastrophic damage, as ice crystals melt rapidly and cellular osmotic gradients swing wildly. The proper technique for frostbite rewarming is controlled, gradual heating, ideally in a hospital with proper equipment. You don't have that luxury, you're going to rewarm whether you want to or not as the sun rises and ambient temperature increases. But you can try to make it gradual by staying in your shelter a bit longer, letting your body warm slowly rather than exposing yourself immediately to whatever sunlight is available. Second, you need to protect frozen tissue from refreezing. A freeze-thaw-refreeze cycle causes exponentially more damage than a single freeze. If your toes thaw and then refreeze, you'll almost certainly lose them. This means you cannot remove your boots, cannot expose your feet to cold air, until you're somewhere warm enough to keep them continuously warm. Even if your boots are causing pressure damage, even if you desperately want to see the condition of your feet, you must resist until you have a heat source or are indoors. Third, you need to prepare for the pain. When frozen tissue rewarms, the pain is legendary. The hot aches or screaming barfies that climbers describe involve pain so intense it causes nausea, vomiting, and sometimes fainting. As blood flow returns to frozen extremities and nerves wake back up, you'll experience what might be the worst pain of your life. There's nothing you can do to prevent this. It's the unavoidable price of tissue survival, but knowing it's coming might help you endure it without panicking. The light strengthens from gray to pale blue, that distinctive Arctic dawn color where the sun is still below the horizon, but its light is scattered by the atmosphere. You can see the texture of the snow now, the crystalline structure of your shelter walls, the disturbed area where you've been lying. You carefully, slowly, begin to shift position, preparing to exit. Your body resists. Muscles that have been locked in position for 12 or 14 or 16 hours don't want to move. You force them anyway, grimacing at the pain, taking it slowly. Historians still argue whether the traditional Saka greeting Doro Suboler, roughly, may you endure/survive, carried greater weight than simple politeness, whether it represented a genuine recognition that survival itself was noteworthy. In a climate where winter survival was never guaranteed, where every spring brought news of who had made it and who hadn't, the greeting might have been a sincere blessing rather than a formula. You understand that now. Survival isn't a given. It's an achievement. You've earned the sunrise. You begin the painstaking process of unpacking yourself, removing the moss stuffing from your clothing, shaking out the frozen bits, restoring some mobility to your garments. The moss has done its job, probably saved your life, but it's compressed and ice-laden now, having absorbed moisture from your body and frozen solid. You pull handfuls of it out, tossing it aside, slowly regaining range of motion. Your jacket is stiff with frozen moisture, cracking as you move. Your pants are similar. You look like some kind of ice sculpture coming to life, snow and frost falling from your clothing with every movement. The sky is lightening rapidly now, that moment when dawn accelerates, when the sun approaches the horizon and suddenly it's day rather than night. You can see the taiga around you, the sparse larch trees, the rippled snow surface, the embankment that sheltered you. Everything is crystalline and beautiful, lit by that magical dawn light that makes ice sparkle like diamonds. It's extraordinarily cold, probably minus 70 degrees Celsius or colder, the minimum temperature before the sun adds any warmth. But you've survived it, and now the sun is going to help you rather than abandoning you to darkness. You very carefully begin to extract yourself from the shelter, moving slowly because rapid movement in extreme cold with damaged tissue is asking for disaster. Your muscles don't respond properly. They're stiff, cramped, exhausted, and your balance is questionable. You crawl rather than stand, emerging from your snow hole like some prehistoric creature emerging from hibernation. The outside air hits you, and even though you've been in cold all night, this feels colder. That's the wind, light but present, stripping away even your minimal warmth. But there's sun. The actual sun. A pale disk on the horizon, weak and distant but real. Visible, pumping photons across 150 million kilometers to reach this frozen spot on Earth. You orient toward it instinctively like a plant toward light, and you feel, or imagine you feel, a tiny bit of warmth on your face. It's probably not real, not yet. The sun at this angle and through this cold air doesn't carry much heating power. But psychologically, it's enormous. You're not alone anymore. The sun is here, bearing witness, and the dark night of survival is over. Now comes the reckoning. Assessing damage, determining your next steps, figuring out if you can walk out of here or if you need to stay put and hope for rescue. You sit in the snow, leaning against the embankment that sheltered you, and begin a systematic assessment. Face. Numb but intact, probably some frostbite on nose and cheeks but likely superficial. Hands. Painful, stiff but mobile. Damaged but functional. Core. Shivering violently now that you're not maintaining tight control, but conscious and coherent. Feet. The unknown quantity, the thing you're afraid to fully investigate. You decide to test your mobility without removing your boots. You try to stand, pushing yourself up with your hands against the embankment, and your legs barely respond. On the third attempt, you get yourself upright, swaying, balance questionable. Your feet are wooden blocks at the ends of your legs, but they're bearing weight. You try a step, and your right leg moves forward stiffly. Another step with your left. You're walking barely, awkwardly, but walking. This is good news. Whatever damage your feet have sustained, the major structures are intact enough for mobility. The pain begins then, right on schedule. It starts in your fingers, a burning, stabbing sensation like hundreds of needles being driven under your nails simultaneously. Then your toes, that same sensation but worse because the damage is probably more extensive. Then your face, a deep aching burn across your nose and cheeks. The pain escalates rapidly, becoming overwhelming, and you sink back down to sitting position, gasping, fighting the urge to vomit. This is rewarming pain, this is the price of survival, and you just have to endure it until your body recalibrates. You sit there in the snow, in the weak sunlight of Yakutian dawn, shivering violently, in more pain than you've ever experienced, with significant tissue damage that will take months to heal, possibly with permanent losses. But you're alive. You survived a night at -71 degrees Celsius without fire. Something that traditional wisdom said was impossible. Something that your body wasn't designed to endure. You did it through preparation, through knowledge borrowed from indigenous peoples and modern science, through sheer stubborn refusal to die, and through an amount of luck that you're not going to examine too closely. The sun climbs higher, and the temperature begins its slow rise from lethal to merely dangerous. You have work ahead, getting to safety, treating your injuries, recovering from this ordeal. But right now, in this moment, you allow yourself to simply exist. Cold, damaged, in pain, but alive and bathed in dawn light. You made it through the night. Everything else can wait. The sun's trajectory across the sky is glacially slow, but each degree it climbs brings measurable relief. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but a softening of the cold's edge, a shift from absolutely lethal to merely extremely dangerous. You remain sitting against the embankment, conserving energy, letting your body begin its recovery processes at its own pace. Moving too quickly now, pushing too hard, could trigger cardiac events or cause you to collapse from exhaustion. Survivors of extreme cold exposure often die in the hours immediately following rescue because their bodies, pushed beyond all reasonable limits, simply fail once the immediate threat passes. You're acutely aware of this possibility, so you force yourself into patience, into stillness, even though every instinct screams at you to get moving, to find warmth, to escape this frozen landscape. The rewarming pain has settled into a constant, grinding agony that emanates from your extremities. Your fingers feel like they're being simultaneously burned and frozen, an impossible combination that your nervous system struggles to interpret. Your toes are worse, deeper, more pervasive pain that suggests more extensive damage. And your face, particularly your nose, throbs with each heartbeat, swollen tissue pressing against frozen skin. You know from reading survival accounts that this pain will persist for hours, possibly days, and that it's actually a positive sign. Pain means nerves are intact, means tissue is viable, means recovery is possible. It's the absence of pain, the comfortable numbness of deep frostbite, that signals irreversible damage. You examine your hands carefully now that there's light to see by. You remove your mittens slowly. The material is stiff with frozen moisture and frozen breath condensation, and look at your fingers. They're pale, almost waxy, with distinct white patches on the fingertips and along the first joint of each finger. The skin has a strange texture, slightly firm, slightly swollen. This is frostbite, probably first degree with patches of second degree, which means you'll lose some superficial tissue. The outermost layers of skin will eventually blacken, die, and slough off, but the underlying structures are probably intact. You'll keep your fingers, though they'll be sensitive to cold for the rest of your life, possibly permanently numb in spots, prone to frostbite recurrence. You carefully replace your mittens, protecting the damaged tissue from further cold exposure. Your feet remain unknown territory. You desperately want to remove your boots and assess the damage, but you know this would be catastrophic without access to continuous warmth. Once thawed, frozen tissue must stay thawed. And there's no warmth source here, no fire, no heated shelter, just gradually rising ambient temperature that won't reach even minus 40 degrees Celsius for another hour or two. Your feet are staying in those boots until you reach safety, however long that takes. The uncertainty is agonizing, the not knowing almost worse than knowing bad news, but discipline wins out over curiosity. Your boots stay on. Let's talk about real cases, actual documented survivals of extreme cold, because you've now entered that rare category of people who have experienced and survived conditions at the edge of human endurance. There's the famous case of the Donner Party, though their situation was different, trapped at altitude but with some shelter and fire. There's Beck Weathers on Everest, left for dead at minus 40 degrees Celsius or worse, who somehow survived the night and walked back to camp, though he lost his hands and nose. There's Anna Bagenholm, whom we mentioned earlier, who survived the coldest body temperature ever recorded in an accidentally hypothermic patient. But pure survival of a night in the minus 70 degrees Celsius range without fire and with only improvised shelter? That's exceptionally rare in the literature, almost unprecedented. The indigenous peoples of Yakutia have oral histories of extreme survival, hunters caught out in storms, travelers whose sleds broke down, individuals who became separated from their groups. But these stories are often fragmentary, lacking the medical detail that modern researchers crave. Did these survivors experience frostbite? Of course. Did they sometimes lose fingers, toes, or limbs? Certainly. But they survived, and their survival was considered noteworthy enough to be remembered and retold. You're now part of that tradition, whether you intended to be or not. You've tested the absolute limits of what an unmodified human body can endure, and you've discovered that those limits are slightly farther than most people believed. This isn't heroic, you realize. It's barely even voluntary. You survived because turning back wasn't an option, because the alternative was death, and death is surprisingly unappealing when you're actually facing it. You survived through a combination of preparation, borrowed knowledge, improvisation, and sheer bloody-minded stubbornness. There was no moment of transcendence, no spiritual awakening, no profound insight about the nature of existence. There was just cold and pain and the tedious repetitive work of keeping yourself alive minute by minute. If anything, the experience has been profoundly humbling. You're not a superhuman survivor, you're just a regular human who got lucky and who happened to know just enough to avoid the most obvious fatal mistakes. The shivering is finally beginning to ease slightly as your core temperature stabilizes. You're probably still hypothermic by clinical standards, core temperature likely in the 34 to 35 degrees Celsius range, which is mild hypothermia, but you're trending in the right direction. Your body's heat production is finally exceeding heat loss as the ambient temperature rises and the sun adds its weak but meaningful energy to the system. You can feel the metabolic shift, the way your body is slowly ramping down from crisis mode, beginning to allocate resources to things other than pure survival. You're becoming hungry. Not the background hunger you've been ignoring all night, but acute, demanding hunger that signals your body wants to replenish the massive caloric deficit you've incurred. You have no food, of course, but you have snow, and you need hydration desperately. You take a handful of clean snow and begin melting it in your mouth, slowly, letting small amounts turn to water before swallowing. The cold is shocking against your damaged mouth and throat, but the hydration is necessary. You're severely dehydrated from respiratory water loss, cold diuresis, and hours of metabolic stress. Rehydration needs to happen gradually. Drinking large amounts quickly could cause electrolyte imbalances and cardiac issues, but it needs to happen. As you sit there, sipping tiny amounts of snowmelt, you become aware of your appearance. You must look absolutely feral. Clothing encrusted with ice and frozen debris, face swollen and discolored from frostbite, moss and bark fragments still clinging to your jacket, hair matted and frozen under your hat. If someone stumbled across you right now, they'd probably think you were a corpse that had been frozen and partially thawed. The thought is darkly amusing, and you find yourself laughing, a rasping, painful sound that probably signals some degree of hysteria but also feels therapeutic. You've survived something absurd. Looking absurd seems appropriate. Historians still argue whether the transformation of Yakutia during the Soviet period, industrialization, urbanization, the introduction of modern heating and housing, represented progress or cultural loss. On one hand, fewer people died from cold exposure, living conditions improved dramatically, and life expectancy increased. On the other hand, traditional knowledge was devalued, younger generations lost skills that had kept their ancestors alive for centuries, and the cultural identity of the Saka people became partially disconnected from their environment. It's a complex question with no simple answer. But sitting here, having survived through a combination of traditional techniques, moss insulation, snow shelter, breathing methods, and modern knowledge, understanding of hypothermia, thermodynamics, physiology, you think maybe the answer isn't either slash or. Maybe it's about integrating the wisdom of both approaches, respecting traditional knowledge while also valuing scientific understanding. The temperature has risen to perhaps minus 60 degrees Celsius now, maybe even minus 55 degrees Celsius. Still cold enough to kill through prolonged exposure, but noticeably less vicious than the minus 71 degrees Celsius of deep night. Your breathing is easier, you're shivering less violent, and you're beginning to think about logistics. How far to the nearest habitation, whether you can walk that distance with damaged feet, whether you should stay put and hope for rescue or attempt self-extraction. You don't have definitive answers, but the fact that you're capable of considering the questions is encouraging. Your cognitive function is returning, the hypothermic fog lifting, and you're able to think through problems sequentially and logically. You decide to attempt standing again, to assess your mobility more thoroughly. Using the embankment for support, you push yourself upright, and this time it's marginally easier. Your legs respond with less delay, your balance is more stable, and though your feet are still wooden blocks, they're bearing weight consistently. You take a step, then another, testing. Walking is possible, awkward, painful, but possible. If the nearest habitation is within a few kilometers, you might be able to reach it. If it's farther, you'll need to pace yourself carefully, rest frequently, and hope your damaged feet hold up. You take stock of what you have. Your clothing, damaged and ice-laden but still functional. Your shelter, no longer needed but a testament to what kept you alive. Your body, damaged but operational. Your mind, fatigued but clear. It's not much, but it's enough. You've already done the impossible, survived the night. Walking out seems almost anticlimactic by comparison. There's a sound in the distance, mechanical, artificial, completely out of place in this frozen wilderness. You freeze, listening, and it comes again. An engine, probably a snowmobile or possibly a truck on a winter road. It's distant, hard to localize, but it's definitely there. Someone is out here, traveling, possibly searching. You try to shout, but your voice is barely more than a croak, torn raw by hours of breathing cold air. You wave your arms instead, hoping against hope that whoever it is might see you against the white landscape. The sound grows closer, and then you see it. A figure on a snowmobile, bundled in proper cold weather gear, approaching from the direction of the nearest village. They've seen you, your waving arms, your disrupted snow shelter, your presence where no person should be. The snowmobile pulls up, and the rider, a Saka man, probably a hunter or herder, removes his face covering and stares at you with an expression that combines shock, confusion, and something like awe. He speaks in Saka, which you don't understand, but his tone conveys his thoughts clearly enough. What are you doing here? How are you alive? You try to explain, but your voice won't cooperate, and anyway, what would you say? That you attempted to survive a night without fire in -71 degrees Celsius? That you succeeded through moss insulation and snow shelter and sheer stubbornness? Sounds insane even to you, and you lived it. Instead, you just gesture to your shelter, to yourself, and shrug. A universal gesture that means it's a long story, and I'm not sure I understand it myself. The man doesn't ask further questions. He helps you onto his snowmobile, your damaged feet make mounting difficult, and wraps his spare coat around you. It's a traditional Saka coat, reindeer hide, properly made, and the difference is immediate and shocking. This is what real cold weather gear feels like, what you should have had all along. The warmth isn't dramatic, the coat can't provide heat, only retain it, but the insulation quality is far superior to your modern gear, and you feel your shivering begin to ease almost immediately. The ride to the village is a blur of snow and motion and increasing warmth as your body continues its recovery. The man drives carefully, avoiding bumps that would jostle your damaged extremities, glancing back occasionally to check that you're still conscious. You are barely fatigue threatening to pull you under now that safety is assured, but you stay alert through force of will. The village, when you reach it, is small. Maybe 30 buildings, smoke rising from chimneys, the essential architecture of human survival in extreme cold. The man brings you to what appears to be a community center or clinic, and suddenly there are people, voices, hands helping you inside, concerned faces assessing your condition. Someone removes your boots carefully, exposing your feet, and there's a collective intake of breath. Your toes are discolored, swollen, clearly frostbitten, but they're still attached, still present. Someone else is examining your hands, your face, cataloging damage with practiced efficiency. They have experience here, you realize. In Yakutia, frostbite isn't a rare medical emergency. It's a routine winter hazard, and the local medical practitioners have seen it countless times. They know how to assess severity, how to manage rewarming, how to prevent the most common complications. You're in better hands than you might have been at a major city hospital with all its advanced equipment but no real experience with extreme cold injury. The pain escalates dramatically as proper rewarming begins. They've placed your feet in tepid water, the correct temperature for controlled thawing, and the sensation is indescribable. You've read about the hot aches, heard them described by mountaineers and Arctic explorers, but reading about pain and experiencing it are entirely different things. You grip the edges of the basin, breathing through clenched teeth, occasionally crying out involuntarily, and the medical staff nods sympathetically. They know. They've seen this before. The pain means recovery, means tissue survival, means you'll keep your feet even if you lose some toes. Hours pass in a haze of pain, warmth, medical care, and gradually returning normalcy. They feed you hot soup, nothing fancy, just broth and a little meat, but it's the best thing you've ever tasted. They give you warm drinks, monitor your vital signs, check your core temperature periodically. You're warming slowly, safely, and your hypothermia is resolving without complications. By late afternoon, your core temperature is back to normal, your shivering has stopped, and you're left with just the damage. Frostbitten extremities, exhaustion, dehydration, and the knowledge that you survived something extraordinary. The prognosis, delivered through a translator since few people here speak English, is cautiously optimistic. Your fingers will recover mostly, you'll lose some surface tissue, maybe the tips of 2 or 3 fingers will be partially amputated, but you'll retain function. Your face will heal, though you'll have scars and permanently altered skin texture. Your feet are the major concern. At least 3 toes on each foot are severely frostbitten and may need amputation, and you'll have chronic pain and cold sensitivity for life. But you'll walk again, you'll function, you'll recover. You think about the night, about the cold, about the moss and the snow shelter and the endless hours of endurance. You think about the Saka people who've lived here for a millennium, who developed the knowledge that saved your life, who understood cold in ways that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. You think about the arbitrary nature of survival, how small decisions, angle of shelter, thickness of insulation, timing of hand warming compound into life or death outcomes. And you think about the fact that you'll carry this night with you forever. In your damaged tissues, in your dreams, in your understanding of human limits and resilience. You survived -71 degrees Celsius Yakutia without fire, sleeping through the night against all odds, and you emerged changed but alive. It's not a story you'd recommend anyone try to replicate, but it's your story now, written in frostbitten flesh and hard-won wisdom. The clinic grows quiet as evening approaches, and you find yourself drifting in that space between waking and sleeping, warm for the first time in what feels like forever. The pain in your extremities has settled into a manageable ache, helped by medication but also by the simple knowledge that the worst is over. Through the window, you can see the sun setting, that same sun that rose to save you this morning, now completing its brief arc across the Yakushan sky. Tomorrow it will rise again, and the day after, and gradually the winter will release its grip on this landscape. Spring will come eventually, as it always does, bringing warmth and light and the memory of cold as something endured and survived rather than as immediate threat. You think drowsily about what you'll tell people when you return to wherever home is. The simple version, I survived a night in extreme cold, or the complex version with all its small moments of terror and decision and luck. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe survival stories are always inadequate because the experience itself exists beyond language, beyond description, in the realm of sensation and endurance that can't quite be captured in words. You tried something that traditional wisdom said was impossible, and through preparation, borrowed knowledge, improvisation, and luck, you succeeded. That's enough. That's everything. Outside, the temperature is dropping again as night returns, probably heading back down toward -60 degrees Celsius or -70 degrees Celsius. But you're inside now, behind proper walls, near a proper fire, wrapped in warmth and safety. The cold is out there, as it always is in Yakutia in winter, patient and absolute and indifferent. But it no longer has any claim on you. You faced it, endured it, and emerged on the other side. Your body will heal gradually over months. Your understanding of your own limits and capabilities has been permanently recalibrated. And somewhere in your memory, preserved with crystalline clarity, is the knowledge of what it means to survive the impossible. One breath at a time, one moment at a time, refusing to surrender until dawn arrives and the world is illuminated once more. Sleep takes you gently, your body finally allowing itself to rest completely, secure in warmth and safety. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, medical procedures, recovery, the long journey home. But tonight, you simply rest, knowing that you've already done the hardest thing, already proved that human beings, fragile, poorly adapted to cold, but stubborn and clever and determined, can survive even at the edge of what physics and biology should allow. Sweet dreams come easy when you've earned them through a night of endurance in -71 degrees Celsius, when you've looked into the face of the cold and refused to blink.